Hello and welcome to the Research-to-Practice Transit Symposium. It will take place today through Thursday, so October 28th through 30th, 2025. Thank you so much for registering and presenting. I'm really looking forward to all the conversations about how we can best implement the latest in transit research and state of the art and state of the practice into reality. And I'm your host, Chad Writing from Caltrans Division of Planning and Modal Program Management. We have an exciting lineup for today. Our first speaker will be Andrew McCurran, moderated by Brendon Hemily. Andrew McCurran is Head of Strategic Planning for TransLink in Vancouver. That will be followed by a break of 15 minutes. After that will be a session on performance metrics with a moderator, Greg Newmark, and Dr. Celeste Chavis, Hunter Owens, and James Rubin, followed by another break and a double session with people who submitted abstracts for the symposium who will present, followed by a panel discussion that will be moderated by John Ando, with speakers Javad Esmailpour, Dr. Reza Mahmoudi, Dr. Bogdan Kapatsila, and Mariel Kirshen. Thanks to our sponsors, California Department of Transportation or Caltrans, the UC Davis Transit Research Center, the American Public Transportation Association, the University of Florida Transportation Institute, the Mineta Transportation Institute, and the Smarter Center. Thanks to the steering committee who helped plan this event, and a special thanks to the Caltrans employees Fahima Sheikh, Alicia Keith, Jane Fortes, and Caitlin Chansky, who participated in spreading the word and doing the graphics for this. Of course, thanks to all of the participants for today. This event is on the website of the American Institute of Certified Planners at the link below. You can also find this on the symposium website. So very excited for people that can get these credits. If there are any panelist questions or technical issues, please feel free to mail us at pm2.research@dot.ca.gov. And finally, thank you so much for participating. We're really looking forward to this 3-day event and all of the great discussions we'll have. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brendon Hemily, who will introduce the session and moderate it with our presenter, Andrew McCurran. Here's to you, Brendon.
Chad, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Brendon Hemily. I'm an independent consultant in the public transportation space for many, many years. And I've been on the organizing committee for this event, which for the last couple of years. And when we were thinking about this event, part of the focus is looking at research, applied research, and how it gets operationalized in the transit industry. And one of the topics that we all face is the issue of the fiscal cliff. All transit agencies are facing this, both in Canada and in the US. In fact, in Canada, the situation is a bit more dire even than in the US because the federal government was less generous and the money has run out faster. But in thinking about how we could get this topic into the symposium, I suggested that we could ask Andrew to make a presentation. I saw this presentation about the basic framework of having a very coherent strategic approach to thinking about funding public transportation in a sustainable way and focusing on the benefits that different groups receive from investment in transit. And I thought this would be a perfect launch for the symposium to get us seeing how you can do internal thinking in a strategic, coherent way, and then operationalize it as you negotiate with the different partners that you need to have. So we'll have Andrew will make his presentation, and then we'll have some minutes for questions at the very end. Andrew, I can see your first slide, so I'll let you take it away.
There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, okay, perfect. And you can see my screen okay?
See the screen okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Brandon, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here and participate in today's panel sessions. Looks like a really interesting lineup. As Brendon said, this fiscal cliff challenge that nearly every transit system in North America, if not the world, is facing coming out of the pandemic. I'm interested in proposing some thoughts on how we can have a more structured conversation around how to resolve this challenge. But first, I wanted to start with some foundational context. You know, I think most folks in the room are familiar with the history of the 20th century's significant funding of public funds and subsidies to support the rise and dominance of automobility. Just to quickly list those, significant public investment in highway construction and maintenance, oil industry support, automobile industry support, mandated parking, car-dependent land use and zoning policies is a really big one. As we say, the best transportation plan is a good land use plan. Traffic safety and emergency services costs for traffic accidents and traffic policing, the negative externalities, the list is numerous there that are left unpriced, the opportunity costs of investing in roads instead of transit. So those are significant subsidies. Ultimately, I don't like to use the word subsidies, but in this context at the beginning of the presentation, just thinking about subsidies as money that beneficiaries contribute that are not directly users. So other non-user beneficiaries contributing funds to making the system work. So that's on the road side. So to compete with driving in that context, through the 20th century, transit also needed to be subsidized at increasingly higher levels from, it's our original days as mostly private, mostly streetcar operators. We're making some money through land development, but also through fares that could cover the cost of the system. Today, we need to, for transit to be competitive and financially viable, a significant portion of its operating costs are covered by other beneficiaries. Just as a little scan across here, this is a selection of transit systems in North America, with the TTC and WMATA being quite high operating cost recovery at the fare box, to some systems with less transit-oriented land use, probably easier and cheaper parking on the right-hand side with much lower cost recovery. But all this to say is that this sort of sets up the context for the challenge, because then as transit demand grows, the fare revenue that the transit systems are collecting is only covering part of the costs. And the remainder of the revenues are typically growing in fast-growing cities where transit demand is growing potentially quite quickly as they're densifying. The rest of those revenues are only growing likely more in line with population. And so I think that's a fundamental dynamic. This isn't about our current fiscal cliff. This is about the fundamental dynamic of transit in contemporary North America, let's say, or the Western world, the developed world. So non-fare revenues typically growing no faster than population. This is a graph of growth in Metro Vancouver in the first decade and a half of the 21st century, where our population grew 20%, but our revenue passengers grew 80%. So there is a constant need, really, to talk about how are we going to fund transit to keep pace with those demands. Okay, that brings us to our current moment, the current challenge. After decades of balanced budgets in the post-pandemic world, TransLink, as almost every system in North America, has faced significant financial challenges. We faced a $650 million a year structural deficit, driven by really three main factors. And I want to spend just a minute on this graph because I think it's helpful. It's illustrative of the kind of shape of the dynamic going on here for folks who aren't directly involved in understanding the finances of your local transit system. The colored bars below represent the revenues that we're getting from the different primary beneficiary groups here, with the property owners, with motor vehicle users being the orange, and transit users, that blue bar. We can see, in 2019, before the pandemic, the expenses, which is that top dotted line, really lined up with our revenues. But then with the pandemic, we had significant drop in fare ridership, or in transit ridership, which led to a significant drop in transit fare revenues. Our system, TransLink's funded, as you can see that orange bar, pretty significantly with revenues from motor vehicle users through a fuel sales tax. And with more efficient and more electric vehicles, that has meant that fuel tax revenues are declining. And that decline has accelerated with the uptake of EVs, but also more fuel efficient internal combustion engine vehicles. And then, of course, the third dynamic that all of us have been facing is this more significantly accelerating inflation over the last number of years that has increased all of our costs at a pace that's gone faster than our ability for fare revenue in particular to catch up. The TransLink has now we're earning more fare revenue today than we were before the pandemic. Our ridership has largely caught up to pre-pandemic levels. But because of that structural, that decline in revenues for a period of time and that increase in cost, that structural gap, as you can see in this white section, has remained. Now, as Brendon, you mentioned, senior government, state government, or federal government pandemic relief funds that both in Canada and the U.S. we were grateful to receive, and were really important to see systems through the most difficult acute part of the pandemic. That money there is reflected in this red hashed line, and the remainder, that money runs out now. So this is essentially the dynamic behind the fiscal cliffs that transit systems across North America are facing now in the coming years, or as we've been seeing with SEPTA, TriMet, and Chicago, a number of systems that have hit that fiscal cliff. This is data from APTA's report, a policy brief from 2023 around this very topic, and concluded that around 71% of large transit systems face a fiscal cliff by 2028, and 51% of all transit systems. This is we're at a pivotal moment here. We're seeing systems actually need to make significant cuts to respond to that, so those significantly lowered revenues. There's an article by Jarrett Walker in the top left hand of this screen here, Should We Let Public Transit Die? Very thoughtful conversation around some of the political dynamics going on here and how we might respond. I'll touch on some of those ideas in the rest of my presentation here. In the context of TransLink, without new revenues, we did some work with InterVistas, an economic consulting firm, that TransLink's transit service would, if we did reduce it by the 60 to 65% that we would need to do to respond to the fiscal cliff, that in those dramatic cuts scenarios, households in Metro Vancouver would be up to $900 worse off each year, due to a number of those impacts you can see on the screen. And that is we were doing that analysis just for the household impacts, not the broader economic or broader society impacts. And so from just strictly a household pocketbook perspective, the cuts that we were talking about implementing would leave households $900 worse off every year. And we certainly wouldn't need $900 more per household to stave off those cuts. So I think this is a really important bit of analysis that each region, every system should be thinking about trying to do, to communicate, it's not just about, well, we can't come up with the money so we're going to have to make the cuts. These are typically in most urban regions where transit does play an important role in the transportation system and the functioning of the economy. Households will be worse off with less transit. Okay, so with that context, a framework for resolving the funding challenge. We've been having some conversations on this topic in Metro Vancouver for a number of years. We've been lucky enough at TransLink to have a fairly robust transit funding model, and I'll describe a few of the components here. But we have gotten by over the last, in recent memory, with some incremental increases to contributions from different beneficiary groups here and there. We haven't had to step back and have a really thoughtful, more robust conversation on the whole framework and sort of how does it all fit together. But the scale of the challenge is so significant now, as it is for most, I would say most transit systems in North America, at least medium and larger ones, that we can't just sort of muddle our way through. There needs to be a really coherent, I think, policy-based framework that one can communicate easily as an elected official or as a policymaker, as technical staff supporting this work, as academics, making the case for why people should contribute to funding public transit. You could broaden this to regional transportation more generally. I'm focusing on just public transit here today. Okay, the first piece, I think be cost effective. This goes without saying, but is really important to put up front. Be entrepreneurial. So those two first pieces, number one and number two, are intended to really reduce the burden that then needs to be requested of taxpayers or users to help fund the system. So we start with a really solid foundation of cost effectiveness and entrepreneurialism. And then the third core component here of the framework is to ask beneficiaries to contribute their fair share, ideally based on the value they receive and ideally based on their ability to pay. There are three broad categories of beneficiaries that I think are pretty comprehensive at capturing the groups, the individuals that you could sort of put into identifiable groups that benefit from investment in public transit. Under system users, transit users, road users, and property users, so people who are making use of a property, living there or working there. And then in the middle, landowners, and on the far side, economic participants, so regional or consumers and value creators at the regional, provincial, and national level. So on the system users are getting really that direct access to the system. That's the benefit they're getting. Landowners are gaining private wealth as a result of public investment in the system. If you happen to own a parcel of land right next to where a new transit station or a bus stop opens up, economic participants get the benefit of more economic and social value and choice. And then the final piece of the framework here is consider pricing negative externalities. And I think we view in Metro Vancouver, I personally think it's very important really to think of the first three components as the core, the foundation of a sustainable funding framework. And that this fourth piece is really should be thought about as supplemental funding. I'll talk about that in a little bit here. So the first piece, be cost effective, take steps to improve your productivity. In TransLink's case, we committed, or we launched our own efficiency review with Ernst & Young, with EY, who made a number of recommendations, and we're implementing all of those. This is this $90 million in cost cutting as a demonstration that we are looking under every pillow cushion to find all the change that we can scrounge to really make sure that we are delivering the most cost-effective, productive service that we possibly can. A key part of that is also ensuring that we're actually collecting all the revenues that are owed to us. So we did launch a more stepped up fare enforcement program this past year, and that's going quite well in terms of the revenues that we're able to recover, higher than we initially forecast. Be entrepreneurial, leveraging commercial opportunities. A key step in that direction. I think that every transit agency, authority, municipality, but especially thinking about your transit assets, can really think about how to redevelop or to develop on top of transit facilities to allow for people to live and work in places close to transit, but using your transit land to generate revenue through real estate development is something we've just, years in the making, but now just starting to realize with a number of projects in Metro Vancouver. Now, I should say that's not going to return a lot of revenue for some number of years, but this is, an important contributing revenue tool. Other commercial opportunities, there's tons of them, from retail partnerships and advertising to services at stations and bus stops and exchanges. The key thing here is both that you're generating revenue, but also that you're demonstrating to the public that you're being cost effective and entrepreneurial, that you really are trying every angle. The key part of the framework, as I described, though, is really the beneficiaries component with system users, landowners, and economic participants. They benefit from improved access, from passive wealth gain, and from increased choice and productivity. In Metro Vancouver today, this is the list of tools that we use to collect contributions from each of those beneficiary groups. On the far right, those tools are primarily or exclusively collected by senior governments, the province and the federal government, and so contributed back to localities and to transit systems through transfers, typically through capital grants. But I know in the U.S. there's also direct operating revenues that are provided. One thing just to mention here, I think we collect a standard property tax that's a regional property tax dedicated to transit in Metro Vancouver. It's got a property improvements and a land component. So the BC Assessment Authority assesses the value of every property every year, split into essentially the value of the buildings on the land and the land itself. So actually, it's really two taxes merged into one. We don't have the ability to set different mill rates for the improvement portion and the land portion anywhere in Canada, but I know in the US, some jurisdictions do have that ability. So theoretically, that property tax is really reflecting a contribution from the user, who's the size of the building is kind of a proxy for the amount of transportation demand that's generated on that parcel from that use. And then the land value portion, irrespective of how much transportation demand is being generated, there is land value accruing to the owner of that parcel of land that can be collected through a land value tax or the land value portion of a property tax. Okay, the final piece. I'm going to take a little deeper dive here on the opportunity. So that third part of the framework is really about examining who benefits from your transit system, and it might be different in every region. In smaller, more rural places, you might have sort of a different profile. In larger urban centers, a slightly different profile. But generally, these are the categories that I suggest are probably applicable everywhere. Just sort of the degree to which these different beneficiaries are benefiting might change in each region. So it's really up to you to kind of have this conversation and figure out how much should transit users be contributing? How much should motor vehicle users contribute? What about property users and landowners, consumers, thinking about the consumer agglomeration benefits that you get from transit system, from value creators, so those employers and innovators, researchers, goods movers who get some agglomeration and trade efficiency benefits from more efficient urban transportation systems. And the key part here being figure out who's benefiting, who's contributing today through which mechanisms, and where are there gaps in your existing funding model that can be filled with some proposals to invite contributions from some of those users that aren't currently paying their fair share. And then that fourth piece, if policymakers might from time to time want to introduce charges that are meant as a tool to address some specific policy objective as a demand management measure. So it might be to reduce carbon or congestion or traffic fatalities. We're all familiar with these sorts of debates around these tools. Our suggestion here, and I think I do personally think this is a very important point, that these are qualitatively different than the tools that you would think about in that category 3 when you're asking beneficiaries to contribute based on the value they receive. Each of those beneficiaries, whether they're paying a property tax or a fuel tax or a parking tax or a transit fare, that should feel reasonable to them, fair and reasonable, and like, good exchange for the value that they're receiving. With these sorts of tools in category 4, whether it's a decongestion charge or speed camera fine or a carbon tax, they are all intended by their very design to change people's behavior by having a price that people actually notice and feels expensive. And so as a result, there's always going to be equity and affordability impacts that are felt differently across the population, which also translate into public sentiment and political impacts, which makes this kind of tool particularly these are contentious conversations, difficult things to advance, but they can be useful, like absolutely, to achieve the policy objectives that each of them might be designed to set out to do. So the thinking here is that the revenues that one gets from these tools should be hypothecated or separated, put into a separate fund, kept separate from general revenue, with the revenues going entirely towards advancing whatever the particular policy goal is. So if it's, in the case of that article on the right in Ontario, some contention around traffic speed enforcement cameras were perceived as a cash grab. If those had been structured in a way so that all of the revenue was reinvested only in the policy objective, which was to improve traffic safety. Maybe it's intersection redesign or really a traffic safety focused program. And then another good portion of the revenue was used for credits, rebates, exemptions, discounts to folks with less ability to pay, so that we were spreading the burden of those penalties more evenly across people, based on their wealth and income. So those things need to be treated separately, and not, there's often a tendency to think, okay, well, we'll use some of these tools and that'll be the solution to funding transit. They can be a supplementary tool, but they need to be handled in a very special and separate way, so that they are perceived and actually are fair to the public. Okay, a few more slides here. This is to summarize that framework again. Cost-effective, entrepreneurial, ask beneficiaries to contribute their fair share, and then consider pricing negative externalities. How does this framework actually stack up in practice? This is a simplified graphic of TransLink's revenue tools in the Vancouver region. You can see typically we were fairly even between those three main beneficiary groups in the past, although transit users were paying a higher share in the past, less so now after the pandemic. Property owners and users are paying a greater share, in that you can see that contribution from motor vehicle users is declining. And you can see there isn't really a significant contribution from broader society, those economic participants, at least at a regional scale. So, from our perspective, those are probably two areas to explore that if we're looking to refine and make our funding model more robust. Our peer agency, ARTM, in the Montreal region, definitely not much there from motor vehicle users, more heavily relying on property and transit. A little bit more from broader economy, where they have a more direct operating contribution from the provincial government. The city of Toronto, they're also heavily relying on property and transit. New York City, this is an interesting one because I think it's got, probably of any agency, I think in North America, possibly the world, has a quite robust and varied list of revenue tools, but really heavily drawing on those broader economy tools that collect contributions from economic participants, so consumers and employers and businesses and other economic activity. Less here on property, a little bit on vehicle. There's a lot of focus on the central business district tolling program there, but as you can see, it's really actually still quite a small portion of their overall revenue. So, in conclusion, that was just a sort of a snapshot of a couple different systems, mostly to whet your appetite to really think about your own system, and who the beneficiaries are, who's contributing today, where some of the gaps might be. It's meant as really an opening to a public conversation that you would have with your publics, stakeholders, policymakers, the key part here with point number one here is the need to build public trust via cost-effective, entrepreneurial, customer focus, and really telling better stories. All of this requires really good, proactive communication and engagement. Building a sound policy-based case for change to your funding mix based on a current state assessment of who benefits and who contributes and who's not contributing their fair share. Really getting away from pointing fingers at different levels of government. I believe most of us, myself and TransLink included, have thought for a number of years about this funding question as a sort of it's federal dollars or provincial dollars or regional or local dollars. And from a very an agency perspective about like, which agency owns this tax revenue and who should contribute to pay for transit. Instead, it's sort of the funding strategy equivalent of taking a customer centric lens or people centric lens, really thinking about it not from the agency. The agencies, the level of government, we're just flow through. We just happen to collect the contributions and to spend it on behalf of the public. But it's really who are those those primary those beneficiary groups who are actually making the payment contribution, and think about from their perspective what value are they getting and who's not contributing their fair share. We know the affordability crisis. It is top of mind for everyone, for every elected official, certainly in North America. For most households are really feeling the squeeze. So focusing on value, as a first fundamental premise, aiming to link charges as closely as possible to people's ability to pay, making the tools as progressive as possible. If it's making property tax more aligned with the value of homes, or any sort of vehicle related charges more aligned with people's incomes or with the value of vehicles, so that really trying to spread the burden more fairly and equally around across the community of beneficiaries. And then that last point, if we're pricing externalities, make sure to direct those revenues entirely to the policy goal and to protecting affordability. But at the end of the day, this is a framework to have a conversation. There's no right answer. It's a balancing act of ability and willingness to pay, and really up to elected officials to make those determinations on behalf of the public. That being said, having the right governance, so making sure that the right elected officials that are ideally as close as possible to the outcomes of the funding and spending decisions around transit have the autonomy, the accountability, the authority to raise the funds that they need to and make those decisions. So at the end of the day, governance is really central to this. I think those are my final comments. And Brendon, back to you. Happy to have some discussion.
Andrew, that was fantastic. A couple things.
Yeah.
First, I just want to let everybody know my understanding is that the slides and the recordings will be made available. We've done that in the past, and so I know people want to take a look at those graphs. So just we will be making those available in due time. Second thing. I've known for a long time about the real estate division. I've told everybody about it. It's very, very unique. Most transit agencies, or researchers, there's a lot of talk about value capture, but they don't actually organize themselves in ways to actually tackle it. And there are a lot of difficult and challenging there. Senior governments don't really usually like agencies to be, quote, property developers, because it opens up all sorts of thoughts, and they usually just want to fund, narrowly defined transportation specific investments, even though we know that, the whole TOD, TOC type environment relies on having a proactive dialogue with both developers and municipalities to look at the zoning and so forth. I love those slides. The first one, everybody should be doing that. The gap analysis, basically. That was fantastic. But I don't think I'd seen those other slides about ARTM and New York.
Oh, yeah.
Those are really cool. It takes some sophisticated thinking and analysis to break down and to match. I mean, basically, you must have gone through quite an effort to look at all the categories and all the different resource, revenue streams, but to allocate them, I assume there's a lot of assumptions built into all that. Is that, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. This is just myself, my team. We've got a funding strategy team at TransLink. I should give huge credit to them, to Caitlin Cooper, Nick Lovett, Scott Leitch, who have done a lot of the work behind this thinking. And just surveying other agencies' annual reports and plans to sort of dig through their numbers and then make a call about our assessment. Because we are trying to kind of spread the word here and encourage everyone, around this table in this conversation, and all of your colleagues in the transit sector generally, welcome feedback on this framework. First of all, this is very much an iterative conversation. We've been refining it, as Brendon, you've seen a couple versions of this over the last year or two. We have absolutely been refining it based on feedback that we get every time we share it with folks. But our hope is that to the extent we can start to present every system's funding mix in this frame, to think about it from the beneficiary lens, and you're right, Brendon, does require some thinking about, okay, well, who actually is, where is that money actually coming from? And why are we asking that particular group to pay those contributions? Often we don't think about taxes that way. It's a little, tax policy can sometimes just be, oh, well, that, there's a bit, it's convenient to raise that money, or that tool already exists, so we can just increase it a bit. But I think taking this policy-based approach does require you to kind of think about who are those folks that we're asking to pay, what group do they fall under, and why are we asking them to pay? And these broad beneficiary categories kind of provide a framework for, like, generally speaking, as I described in one of those earlier slides, like, this is why we're asking that group to pay. This is the value we think they're getting. And then obviously there's all these subcategories. You can get a little more specific. And obviously the revenues you can collect from groups as they get smaller and smaller are smaller than revenues you might collect from a broader based group.
Right. I mean, this specific one is amazing. I mean, for all the talk about the congestion charging, I mean, the fact that it's so small, in light of all the other range of revenue streams, that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I did not expect that either. Yeah, I thought this was really interesting.
So yeah, this kind of and it also, I mean, it visually is very interesting, because one talks about, in the research literature, about alternative financing mechanisms and so forth, but this actually breaks it down and shows multiple streams. And there's different messages in Canada, outside of TransLink and ARTM, everybody else just relies basically on senior government general revenues and property tax.
Yeah,
it's
very. TTC is a good example of, like, a typical transit
Canadian
system
transit
Canada.
system.
That primary is typically a municipal department, and municipalities, local governments in Canada, pretty exclusively rely on property tax as their primary, revenue tool, and then obviously you can collect some transit fares as well to support the system.
That's all they're actually given, because senior governments tend to be very protective of their general revenue streams. We do not have enabling legislation like in the States that allows for referenda and so forth. But the counterpart is in the States. It would be really, to do this kind of analysis, would show the relative value of fares versus sales tax versus whatever other stream they have access to. So it's a very visual thing. Another thing, I knew about the real estate division. I did not know about the beer, the trading cards, the food trucks. Those are some pretty creative things.
Absolutely, and huge, props to our commercial partnerships team here, that have been doing great work on all of these sort of retail partnerships, and we've got an amazing swag shop. We've got a really creative team, always issuing new, Compass, our fare card products, collectibles that are very popular, like sell out in hours. a really robust advertising program, and then these sorts of partnerships. They don't necessarily, these aren't going to be the kinds of things that fix the significant funding gap we've got, but they are an important contribution. And I think, they also play this other role of being fun and demonstrating some, building goodwill and public support, as well as showing that we are doing everything we can to raise revenue.
Absolutely. I was going to say that. I mean, in your blocks, right at the top, there's the efficiency, but there's also being creative. And this shows that it's really trying very hard. I know, these things don't raise a lot of money, but they're, from an image point of view and from convincing policymakers that you're trying everything you can. I think they would be very significant from that point of view.
Absolutely,
to get extra leverage. Back to the communication issue.
Yeah.
I mean, you stressed how important that is. I guess I wanted to just to follow up on that. Your whole premise is basically identifying user groups and then having their contribution proportional to their benefits. So this sort of comes along in general discussions as, user pay principle. And everybody sort of agrees at that simplified level. But I've been wondering, with your local politicians and provincial governments and so forth, when you actually start breaking it down to these much, much finer levels, do they get it? I mean, or do they get it and then just sort of say, well, my belief in user pay only goes so far. We're not. Yeah. I'm sort of curious how the messages resonated locally.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I think a really ripe one for further research. Actually, like this is where the research and policy world intersects with the communications world that you're asking about, because I think that the first place to start is the framework here. With let's actually identify who the beneficiaries are, who are getting value. And then a next important part, which we've been really trying to do a much better job at, is to actually quantify some with range of analytical techniques, but it's essentially some economic analysis to be able to communicate the actual value that a motor vehicle user driving their car in Metro Vancouver gets from TransLink investment. Now, in our case, TransLink as a multimodal authority actually does make investments in the major road network as well, operating and maintenance of and a number of bridges. But I think the framework, even if we were a transit-only agency, that there's still value that you can quantify to individual road users. So being able to quantify that value is part one, and then communicating the value, I think, is step two. That all of those groups in that beneficiary framework, there really is there are economic analysis techniques that can allow you to put a number beside each of those groups, and then try to assess, how much are they contributing today, and where are there some gaps. So I think the first place of just articulating the framework has been very helpful in shaping the discussion. This isn't something that we've been hitting people over the heads with. It's just more as a way, every time we have a conversation around revenue tools and around how are we going to solve this funding challenge, coming back to this framework has been building, I think, a kind of a common language. So I would say that the most important thing with this framework is so that when if a contribution from one of these beneficiary groups is declining, we think about, oh, that's a problem within that beneficiary group. It's not just we're going to ask some other beneficiary group to pay more, but that we think that this beneficiary group, pick any one of those boxes, is benefiting by this amount. And if for some reason the tool is no longer effectively capturing that that value they're getting, we need to address, find some other tool or refine the tool, whether it's property tax or I think a common thing that all of us in North America and around the world are facing is the declining fuel sales tax. So with that particular example, as opposed to thinking, well, we can fix that declining fuel sales tax by increasing transit fares or property tax. Well, you can have a conversation about the mix, but let's just be really explicit that the problem is the contribution from road users is declining. So let's look within that unit. It sort of helps to focus the conversation.
Yeah.
Obviously, as I made, that final point I made, this is all a balancing act. There's no right answer, and it's up to elected officials to make that determination. But this at least gives, kind of a reasonable policy-based basis for us to have that conversation. So yeah, I'd say it's been quite helpful.
It's that's a good point. For the fuel, the example you just raised about the fuel tax declining, it would open the door towards more discussion, thinking about vehicle mileage based monitoring and taxation. So the sort of experimentations going on in Oregon right now, because then that it's proportional. The benefit is proportional to the amount that you're using the system.
Yeah.
But that's a good point.
Yeah. And I should just say on that
Sure.
point, there's about a dozen tools, we could list that are different ways to collect contributions from motor vehicle users. And they range from like, when you buy your vehicle, when you register your vehicle, when you park your vehicle, when you drive your vehicle, when you charge up your vehicle or fuel your vehicle. So and each of those, there's a whole bunch of different variations on how you might think about collecting that contribution. There's no one right solution. They all have some different, implementation challenges, pros and cons, that each, place needs to think about. But yeah, your example of the Oregon stories, they've been very intentional about making that shift. I think from recognizing the decline in fuel tax and that with the rise of EVs and hybrids, who are no longer paying their fair share. Like, okay, well, how can we what tool can we implement that sort of best replicates the spirit of that charge that we were trying to collect before, which is really a usage-based charge. You pay more the more you use. But that usage linkage was getting broken because, no longer was the amount of fuel you were consuming sort of directly related to the amount you were actually using the system. So yeah, totally good example.
Now, one I'm going to push back perhaps a little bit on is the number 4, the pricing negative externalities.
Yeah, this is always a contentious one.
I totally understand, and so it's your statement that the pricing the externality should be solely used for whatever the area of endeavor is. So. Yeah. I guess in some cases I agree, that's fine. But in other cases, the pricing, the externality is actually aimed at behavior change. So even the one you brought up, the red light or the speeding cameras.
Yeah.
Yes, they're to improve safety, but they're intended to change behavior.
Yes.
To improve safety. So. Yes. I understand, isolating it from general revenue so you don't get the kinds of ads or what's going on in Ontario right now. But I view it a little bit differently. And the same with congestion charging or parking surcharges. I view them more as behavior change to actually improve transit. So you use in London, the congestion charge revenues were used to improve bus service, and they were able to, dramatically improve bus service with those revenues. So it wasn't, just to, there was a policy directive, but it wasn't necessarily linked to the cars or, the parking surcharges are aimed at, sort of following Donald Shoup's research that, parking is really a free giveaway in most cases. So I don't know. What do you think about? You know,
Yeah. This could be, this is another really ripe area for research and discussion. I think both on the like mechanics of these tools, but also on the political economy of these tools, because and the sort of the politics of them. I would venture that these sorts of things would be more viable in more places if we took more of this approach that I'm recommending. And even in the examples that you gave, for example, a decongestion charge in London, congestion was bad enough. I think it had to get quite bad but the transit service that is funded with the revenues from that tool are directly communicated as a congestion relief measure, as an alternative. So
mm,
to folks that now it's going to be much more expensive to drive into central London, but don't worry, we've got these alternatives for you folks who are paying this charge. So I think they're still directly linked. I would recommend taking it one step further from a transparency and public trust and accountability perspective, and actually having a separate kind of
a
fund, an
fund.
account
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
so that anyone can just look and say, okay, how much money was raised from the congestion charge this year, or the decongestion charge, and it's X dollars, and you can see that all of those dollars went into either congestion relief related measures, much of which could be improved bus service, but improved bus service targeting the people who are going to be most affected by that congestion charge, which are probably the folks who are most reliant on driving, who have the fewest options. So yes, it might go to transit, but it's a particular program of transit designed to advance the particular policy goals of decongestion. And
Yeah.
if it was, climate oriented, you might put your transit service into the places where there was the most internal combustion engine driving. And on safety, maybe there's a transit angle there, but probably it's about road redesign. If your goal is let's reduce fatalities, and that's why we're charging this money, I would argue all the money should go really into traffic safety, which is about reducing speed, the design speeds of roads. And that actually takes some money to be able to do. So I think yes, you
I
can do it without this approach, but I think you're much more open to public and political pushback,
reaction. Yeah. Yeah.
as we're seeing in Ontario. So I think I put that slide up there for folks who aren't familiar. In this, a few weeks ago, the Premier of Ontario is proposing now moving forward with banning speed cameras that previously every municipality was allowed to implement, but there was a lot of growing public pushback because folks felt that it was a cash grab, that cities were just doing, and sort of willy-nilly, like charging people for going 1 kilometer over the speed limit all over the place because, wow, what a great source of revenue for cash-strapped municipalities. That is exactly the thing that you need to guard against with this kind of tool.
Yeah, yeah. No, fair enough. And I agree with what you're saying in terms of the messaging. It would probably be much easier to avoid the pushback
Yeah.
in that case.
Yeah, and build public trust and credibility, I think, is the
Right.
most important part. Yeah.
One quick last question. A lot of the focus of your discussion has been on large cities because they have both more modes, they serve more diverse populations in terms of their, what they're looking, how they use and why they use transit, and they have more different revenue tools. Any thoughts about more medium-sized or smaller agencies in terms of using this framework?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. I have done some thinking about that. I think all of these beneficiaries, shown on this slide, are still getting value, even in the smallest, let's say a completely rural county that has a small rural-oriented transit system, that in that case would be primarily a lifeline type service to provide folks with no access to automobiles, so whether that's younger people too old to drive, people with mobility or challenges or disabilities that don't allow them to drive, to still participate in social life and economic life in that community. And so, those individual users, those transit users, get certainly a lot of benefit. You might say, okay, if it's not a congestion-oriented service, then maybe road users don't get as much benefit. But even there, you know what, someone who relies on their car to get around in a rural environment, maybe your car breaks down, you know, and you don't, and that family vehicle is not available for a week. You've got a backup. There is an alternative, you know, or you're injured at some point, or when you age, or so that even if you don't use it now, it doesn't have a huge amount of benefit. There's still a benefit that is quantifiable and that you can talk about. And likewise with the property owners and landowners, maybe the actual value there is smaller, but I think the premise still applies. And likewise with economic, you know, participants, employers get more access to employees who can, you know, maybe travel from further away and in lower density and rural environments where access is frequently really challenging, and employers, I think, have a hard time attracting labor and talent. So, you know, I think all of the categories still apply. They probably just apply in different proportions.
Yeah.
And like the intensity of the value might be less and not as notable, or not necessarily not as noticeable.
Yeah.
But it's still worth articulating and surfacing and having that conversation.
And thinking it through. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, I think our time is up, but I really want to thank you. I think it was a fascinating discussion, and I hope people can take it and then think more about this having a framework. I like this kind of framework more than, you know, the typical input output, you know, okay, how many jobs are created by transit, you know, sort of a very simplistic sort of perspective. This is really trying to match beneficiaries and how their contributions. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Brendon. Looking forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much, Brendon. Really appreciate your hard work on this presentation and your taking the time out to present to us today. We're going to go on a break. The next session will begin at 10:15. So thank you very much, everybody. We will see you in about 13 minutes.
Okay. Welcome back to the first day of the Research-to-Practice Transit Symposium. I am Greg Newmark. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Design and Planning at Morgan State University in Baltimore, and I am thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this session. We are going to have a couple of speakers, and once I learn how to advance my slides. Hunter Owens may not be able to join us, but we will definitely have Professor Celeste Chavis, who teaches here at Morgan State. She is the professor and chair of the Transportation and Urban Infrastructure Studies program here at Morgan. And I am thrilled to be able to have her share her excellent work. So do I need to stop sharing?
The next person should just be able to share their screen.
Okay. I assume you all can hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I decided to maybe go a little off the beaten path with this, because I know there's so many experts in transit here on the call that I thought it would be interesting to really think about how having open data, GTFS data, can be used not only for research and practice, but also for advocacy, as a lot of my work tends to blend research and advocacy together. And so speaking to the choir here, but of course, you know, GTFS data has many purposes, one of which has been to increase transit agency transparency, right, by providing public access to schedules, routes, and real-time arrivals. It's a source of accountability and performance monitoring. It allows for third-party innovation, including researchers, but as well as the general public and public engagement. And of course is used for like benchmarking and comparative analysis. So in my short time, I was probably going to give two kind of little case studies on how we've used both static and real-time GTFS data for not only research, but also looking at advocacy work. The first is looking at access to schools, where here in Baltimore, we are an open choice school district and students take public transit to get to and from school. And the second is just looking at general transit reliability. And both of these have been in part through my role as on the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, which is a nonprofit group that focuses on improving transportation here in the Central Maryland or Baltimore area. Okay, so of course GTMS static is not as fun to look at as the real-time data, but it still has some good uses, particularly when looking at accessibility and overlapping it with other data sets such as census data, or in this case, schools data, where we looked at where students live, as well as in a later study, their absenteeism rates. And so we're not unique in this, but it's a semi-odd situation where we have what's called open choice schools, meaning that students in the middle school and high school level can go technically to any school in the city, and they also use public transit. And so that results in these really long and complicated commutes that they're experiencing. And so this is an older study that we did actually before MTA Maryland had done their redesign. But you can see here, the darker red is where students live, and the yellow are where our high schools are located. And the larger the circle is the more number of seats that school can hold. And so you can see that there's sometimes this disconnect between where the schools are located and where people live. And this is not a great map, but the dark lines are the bus routes, which is really what we rely on here in Baltimore. And a lot of the bus routes go in and out of downtown. And so for students who want to go across the city for school, you have these really long commutes. And so there's this spatial mismatch between residential location, school location, and bus routing. And so what we did was we just looked at, okay, let's assume 100% schedule adherence, which we all know is being very generous. And we just looked at the commute sheds for the different high schools across the city. Now we have a certain set of high schools that are really highly selective. These are ones with some of our engineering programs and so forth that students really want to get into, or our art school. And you can see those are located in the central part of the city, which is quite opposite of where a lot of the students live. And so to get to those schools, really, if you're living on like the western part of the city or some of the northeast parts, you're commuting like an hour and a half by bus often to get to those schools. Now you can get to your neighborhood school very quickly, but those programs aren't available. And so what we were able to do by looking at having the student address, we looked at different schools to see where people were coming from, and looked at, based on where the school was, like the selective schools, people come from across the city, whereas the more neighborhood choice schools is more regional and kind of follows where you have easier access either through walking or transit. And so with that, we were able to compute kind of similar commute metrics that we often see for general riders. We computed those same metrics for our high school students. And this, once again, is best case scenario because it's schedule adherence. But we can see that we're asking our high school students to do pretty complicated commutes. The mean travel time is 36 minutes, which doesn't seem too bad, but when we look at some of the extremes, it gets a little bit worse. We found that 1 in 4 students had commute times that were larger than 45 minutes. We found that the majority of students, about 2/3, had to make a transfer to get to their school. And so this is being a more complicated trip than most of our adult riders were doing, where about half of them transferred. And more importantly, the high school students make up a pretty large amount of ridership at certain hours of the day in particular. And so we wanted to kind of amplify the issues of high school students and what they're experiencing. And so when they had the redesign, one of the things that the organization that I'm part of wanted to know was like, what will be the impact to this large customer base that they had, which were the students. And so one of the things that we did once the initial schedules were released was to do an analysis to see what that proposed redesign was going to do for high school students. And so what we did is we looked at the proposed scheduled data and saw how many schools could be assessed by transit within 45 minutes. Sorry, there's a typo there. And so we saw that 47% of high school students would have seen an increase, about 14% no change, and then 39% a decrease. And then we looked geographically at kind of where those changes were. And then there were some adjustments made after that, and the final report was released. And so this, while it's not the most sophisticated of transit metrics, it was really important from an advocacy standpoint because it got just the conversation started about where high school students looked at, and they were looked at, of course, by the agency, but the public didn't quite know how much it was looked at and what the impact would be. And so this kind of started the conversation, and it allowed for, particularly when we did more neighborhood level analysis, for different neighborhood groups and stuff to kind of advocate for changes for their high school students. All right, so the of course more fun metrics are looking at reliability using the GTFS real-time data. And so you know, the most widely used, of course, is the on-time performance metric, and probably most people have seen this table from the Transit Center, where they just looked at, the different definitions of on-time performance. And here in Maryland, in MTA, we have a relatively generous on-time performance measure where we consider 2 minutes early to 7 minutes late on time, and same with Lamada. So we're kind of on the wider band of that. And so one of the things that I had some students look at where they wanted to create a dashboard using some real-time data where they can kind of dissect some of these performance measures a little bit more, but they wanted to still keep it very accessible for the public with the goal that it would be used for the public. So trying not to do anything that was too difficult to understand. And one thing that they wanted to do was just even compare on-time performance measures. And so they were looking at, MTA's definition of on-time performance measure versus some of the other more common windows of on-time performance measure, and seeing how our agency's on-time performance would be different depending on what that metric was that you're looking at. And of course, they also had some route level information too. The other thing that they wanted to look at was delay propagation, right? So instead of just looking at these kind of route level metrics, they wanted to see how delay is propagating along a route. And so here what they did was they mapped the stop sequence, and the blue line is the average delay. And then the bands are a standard deviation from the average. So some measure of the average and then the variability. And just so for reference, the dash purple line is the 2 minutes early, and the dash blue is the 7 minutes late. And so you can see here that on average, of course, on time, and this is just for one particular route that I just sampled for demonstration, but you can see how that delay is propagating along the corridor. And then, of course, looking at average masked some things. And so they wanted to look at different temporal trends by separating out weekday and weekend. The scale, I apologize, is a little different on the two maps, but you can see that the weekend, no issues with on-time performance compared to weekday. And then same by looking at, AM peak, off peak, and PM peak for the weekday. And here you can see that obviously that the problematic time period is in the afternoon peak, and you can see where along that route that we really start to see very high variability in on-time performance. And so just kind of how that reliability piece factors into the role of advocacy. The Central Maryland Transportation Alliance puts out, I think, every other year a transportation report card. And this report card, which scores transportation, not just transit, but scores transportation in the region. And they look at different metrics. And one of the goals of this is, of course, to continue the conversation around transportation and make sure that it's getting some notice. And so they look at all different types of metrics, but two are closely related to transit. The first is job access, I think within 45 minutes by transit. And then the second is the reliability. And so I was just going to kind of focus on the reliability one. This one is not an analysis that I personally did, but through the role, we helped oversee it. This was done by Aries, which has some really great real-time performance measures, and they, for this, compared it to similar size metropolitan areas to see how we were doing from a schedule adherence point of view compared to other agencies. They also looked at data quality too. When they did this analysis, there was a lot of missing trips also, so that was part of what they looked at as well. And so we will soon be releasing the 2025 report card, and we're expecting to see improvements, hopefully with reliability and so forth. And so this is kind of used as like a way of kind of keeping the region honest, not just transit, but they look at walkability and other metrics as it relates to transportation. And so as I kind of wrap up, you know, some ongoing work that we're looking at is still thinking about agency level metrics, but instead of trip average, which is more from like an operator perspective, thinking about what if we weighted it by ridership, right? If we're on time at all the times of the day where we don't have much ridership, then that's not really representative of the average customer experience. We've been focusing a lot on like schedule-based adherence, but of course, for more frequent service, headway adherence is important. And then also continuing to look at certain points of interest, like high schools, as it relates to reliability. And then in conclusion, we're hopefully gonna launch a new study soon where we're gonna actually survey when passengers are arriving to bus stops, and we still have these reliability metrics. And so we're trying to see if people are changing their arrival patterns, not only based on the schedule, but also based on the reliability in their experience. And so it'll be part video surveillance, part actually asking passengers on the spot their perceptions, and hoping to kind of understand the behavioral piece and how people respond to transit reliability. So I think for the sake of time, I'll stop there and turn it back over to Greg.
Thank you so much, Les. The connection between transit performance metrics and just broader advocacy, you know, within a community. And I'm excited to pass the baton to James.
All right.
Right. And thanks. James is a principal at Transpo Consulting. My apologies. I meant to say that.
At least I'm wearing his clothes today. So good morning or good afternoon to wherever part of the country you are situated in. I am James Rubin. I am a principal at Transpo Consulting. I'll give you a little bit about my background. Spent about 10 years managing market research for MTA New York City Transit here in New York City. Doing all sorts of research on buses and trains and paratransit and delivering those results to leadership to act on them. That's a big part of, you know, what I really focus on in my career, not just delivering results and metrics, but actionable ones. You know, it's one thing for them to fall on the corner of the desk and wait 3 months for the next round of results. It's another thing for the agency to take action. Since I've been working for a company called Transpo Consulting, where We do a lot of this kind of work. We do strategic planning. I myself manage a dashboard with a handful of agencies, about a dozen, who report quarterly on performance metrics, really oriented towards success and success outcomes. And you'll see a little of that as I move forward in the presentation here. I'm also an adjunct professor at Hunter College, where I enjoy teaching future planners to not make the mistakes of the past and to replicate the good stuff of the past. So let's jump right in here. My presentation is a little bit high level. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience from out in the field. I actually did just do a little bit of field work, which is great for me because nothing I enjoy more than going out into the field. Our main survey lead came down with COVID, so I had the wonderful opportunity of running our survey up in Brockton, Massachusetts, and up in Albany. Brockton is a really fascinating place. For those of you who don't know it, it's a suburban city outside of Boston, but it has a really massive recent Haitian immigration there. So about 50% of their system are Haitians, and even about 20 to 25% of their drivers are. So really fascinating study up there in ethnic transportation. So what I want to start to talk about today is this concept of key experience indicators. We're pretty well informed about key performance indicators, but I'd like to introduce this concept of key experience indicators, which I can argue, I think, is more important when we think about how these things influence customers and customer ridership and their propensity to want to use our services as transit providers. So, we start with this idea of key performance indicators. That's the stuff that we've been tracking as agencies for a long time. We have some automated systems that provide some of these, and we have some number crunching and analysts who provide other ones. And, my favorite all-time key performance indicator that I love to pick on is, mean distance between failures, right? Every transit agency likes to track how far their buses and trains can travel before they break down. And I like to say, that's a good metric, but what does that mean to the woman standing on the corner waiting for the bus? If you can tell her, well, our mean distance between failures is down by 10%, she doesn't care about that. She wants the bus to come. And that's a big part of converting from something like key performance indicators to key experience indicators. So that's the first part, is understanding what the customer's experience is. And that's not always directly going to be the same, you'll see in a few minutes, as a key performance indicator. And there really are three distinct categories here. There are key experience indicators for customers. They're the ones who are using the system, right? Getting on trains and buses and paratransit and demand response. But there's also key experience indicators for community members, right? Who may be using transit, but might not, and see transit operate their system through their communities, and understand the benefits. You'll see in a few minutes, I'll show you some of those that transit provides to their communities. And last, which we won't talk about too much today, there are key experience indicators from transit employees. How safe do they feel in their workplace? How much support do they get from their supervisors? Do they understand the mission? But we won't focus on that so much. The other point I want to make about these key experience indicators, and this is a really important point, is that they're influenced by external forces that aren't even sometimes directly related to public transit. Here in New York City, we have lots of local newspapers, the New York Post, the Daily News, and when they run a transit horror story, if I go out and I survey transit customers the week after that transit horror story, by the way, the newspapers really don't publish good news transit stories. It's not a lot of papers aren't sold when you tell people that the commute tonight went perfectly normal. Anyway, when they publish those horror stories, you can see the impacts in customer satisfaction almost immediately. So you see that impact from traditional media, from social media, from hearing stuff from friends and family. But the other two categories I wanted to point out here, which I think are important, are change in history. Transit customers in particular do not like change, and you'll see those key experience indicators come out more negative right after a change. The greatest example in recent times of that has been, the extension of the Long Island Railroad here in New York City to Grand Central Station. They've gone through about 4 or 5 survey cycles, seasonal survey cycles, where customer sat was down on the railroad, even though it was expanded to provide better service to the east side of Manhattan. So that kind of change is really hard for customers to take, and you'll see that in experience indicators. And the last is history. People remember things. So I myself once went up to Co-op City to try to show people about a redesign we were doing in the bus network there, and they didn't want to hear about it. They were too busy being upset about a change that had been made 10 years before that. So how does all of that work? How do we put this all together? I always start with understanding what's most important to customers, and this is hypothesized data. But imagine we went out and we surveyed customers and we said, hey, what's most important to you? And they told us, well, on my security when I'm using transit is important. The vehicle showing up on time is important. How long it takes me to get to my destination is important. Courteous and helpful drivers are important, and some other things are important in that order. We then can look at our agency's key performance indicators, and that's what these look like. Imagine the measures that we have are on the left, and the agency might be a really good progressive agency and actually set goals for these performance indicators, right? It's one thing to just track indicators. It's another thing to actually set goals for them. So some of those might be for security, the number of incidents per 100,000 miles, or for on-time performance, it might be the percent of runs that are on time at time points. For travel time, in New York City, we do this thing called customer journey time performance, which is the amount of time above which it takes the customer to get to their destination than they should have according to the schedule. And maybe around drivers, we have a metric like driver complaints per 100,000 miles. So these are the key performance indicators, but I'd argue that those aren't the things that are influencing ridership as much as these key experience indicators, which are related to the performance indicators, right? So from the customer's perspective, and you see perception here indicating that we're doing this from customer perspectives, it's the perception of personal security and their level of satisfaction, their perception of on-time performance, their perception of travel time, and their perception of drivers. When agencies have both of these sets of data, it's an incredibly powerful position to be in. Because imagine knowing that your customers are really not satisfied with on-time performance, but your agency measure of on-time performance is really, really high. And there's a disconnect there, right? Maybe there's a communications issue. Maybe that's an information issue. We don't know. It might not be a service issue in that case, but having the two sets of data and the two sets of metrics is incredibly important in that context. I want to pivot a little bit to some of the work I do in the industry where we survey. One of the things we face, and you're looking at the 8 largest transit operators in the United States, is that we have absolutely no consistency in the methodology by which we go out and we measure customer satisfaction. I could bounce around this group here, right? The bottom right, MTA, they have a 4-point Likert scale. It's like an excellent, good, poor. I don't remember what the fourth one is, and they really don't want to give that up because they've been measuring it that way since 2020, since 2000 actually, so for 25 years. The MBTA, bottom left, they do a 7-point Likert scale, and they do an online panel. MTA on the top left, I know exactly what they do because I was the architect of their system. It's a massive online survey that we send out of 1.5 million invitations to people, and it's a 10-point Likert scale. By the way, I lost the battle at MTA on the scale there. I did not advocate for a 10-point Likert scale, but that's another conversation for another day. So there's enormous inconsistency across our industry in how we measure customer satisfaction and these customer-oriented metrics. We really do need to move towards a consensus on that because, there's literature and research out there that really does show the best way forward and the different methodologies. One thing I like to do with the agencies that do go out and survey customers is a big piece of what folks are dealing with right now are personal security issues in the transit system. We certainly are here in New York, but a lot of the agencies I work with in Denver and even in Albany, Portland, Oregon, have real serious personal security problems in their system, and it's influencing customers' perceptions. One of the problems is too often on our customer surveys, we simply ask how safe do you feel on transit, and that really doesn't give us enough information. I can tell you from doing this work here in New York City that very often a customer's perception of their safety and security inside of a transit station, on a bus or a train, is very much a function of their perception of the community in which that stop or station is in. So what we've taken to is we started to ask customers not just how safe they feel on board buses or at bus stops, but we also ask about in a supermarket or a grocery store in their neighborhood, or even on the sidewalk in their neighborhood. And we compare those results. The comparison gives us a lot more information. So here, these are real results, by the way, but I've taken the agency's name out of the picture, even though they did particularly good here. You don't see a lot of red, for example, on the chart showing negative perceptions of safety. But here you can see that -9 showing that there is a bit of a difference here in the split between customers' perceptions of onboard safety and their safety perceptions in the grocery store. Customers feel a little bit less safe on board a bus than you do at a grocery store. However, the comparison between bus stop and sidewalk is pretty close at -4, close to 0. Customers feel almost as safe at a bus stop as they do in their neighborhood sidewalk. Super important work to do, particularly as we start thinking about solutions in the transit space for personal security. Is it a community problem? Do we need to work with local law enforcement? Or is it a transit problem? And the last thing I wanted to talk about is our community value work and the kind of surveying we do, not just of transit customers, but of communities around the country. And this I find, this blows me away every time I see a set of results, right? Which is they're incredibly consistent, no matter what city or metro area we do this work in. So we send this out to a statistically significant sample of the community, and we always get back that a very small percentage of that community actually uses transit, right? Unless you're in some place like New York City, but for the most part, in most metro areas, we're looking at 3, maybe 4% of the community actually using transit. But without fail, 80 to 90%, depending on the city and the metro area, of the community will tell us that the transit provides value to their community. And think about that, right? 4% are using it, but 85% are saying, I don't use it, but I do think it provides value. And they are very, very clear in the metrics that we track and in what they think provides that value. And it's the same 3 repeated over and over again from coast to coast. Most important, access to jobs. Second, mobility for folks with special needs. And the third is to be an affordable option for low-income families. These 3 come up on community survey after community survey with a lot of consistency. The fourth one that I'm seeing a little bit more these days is access to medical facilities, which is a growing need and a growing value in transit. And we are working with a couple of transit agencies that are tracking that access through our connectivity metrics, specifically to the region's largest hospitals. So with that, I will conclude and say thank you and turn things back over to our host, Greg.
Thanks, James. I really enjoyed that and learned a lot. I can't see myself, but there we go. Sorry. All right. Before we go into questions, since I'd kind of promised 3 presentations, I do want to just kind of throw out some ideas from some of the work that we've been doing to utilize the National Transit Database. So since the National Transit Database is such a big burden on transit agencies, I think it's really incumbent on researchers and on policymakers to leverage this data set. And so kind of harkening back to Stephen's presentation as the keynote, this is just a slightly different way of looking at the operating subsidy information that's in the NTD, which is relating it to the region served, to the population of the region served. So at a per capita basis, we really do see very different commitments to funding transit, and also from very different sources, right? So the federal sources are relatively consistent, but the willingness to add local or state monies on top of that do vary. And then the next measure we wanted to look at is something, which is what is it that we're trying to put out there? And so we have kind of been arguing for a transit efficiency metric, which is, basically the average vehicle load across the whole region, right? Getting away from looking at operator by operator, which can be very problematic if you have like a commuter bus operator serving a commuter rail operator. They're going to have very, very different performance characteristics. So stepping back to the community level to get a kind of a regional efficiency measure, which is just defined as the miles traveled by the vehicle revenue miles, gives us some sense of efficiency. And you can see when we compare that to operating subsidy per capita, they're actually really correlated. I don't want to make any causal claims here, but I just want to note the correlation. We then realized that we could actually break out that efficiency metric into a kind of a provision component and a usage component, right? So that if the usage is the personal or people miles traveled per resident, and the provision is the vehicle revenue miles per resident. If we put them on a scatter plot, the slope is actually our efficiency measure. And so what we're showing here are two different levels of efficiency. The red line shows the median, and the blue line kind of segregates the top 10% of systems. And so you can see for lower provision, meaning places that have fewer than 20 vehicle revenue miles per resident, you can see who are the kind of top performers. And then on the right side, for the larger provision systems, you can also see, kind of where how systems fall out. I'm showing data from 2018 because it's just so much easier to see. Because when I go to 2022, and the scales are the same, but you can see that there's been, of course, a known collapse in efficiency, although, some rebounding. And this, by the way, is showing something like all 175 or so regions that are over 200,000 people in the urbanized area. So I just wanted to throw these out as different ways to use the NTD data and to think about transit performance, hopefully in ways that are more comparable across regions, and also help us think about what really transit is offering, and how can we make that better. So with that very short presentation, I want to go stop sharing and ask our panel a couple of questions, some of which have been pre-prepared. Oop. All right. So again, I just want to thank everyone. We only have 10 minutes. There were a couple of questions that came in before we even started, and I want to touch on some of those, even though they're not exactly what you guys covered, but you have great wisdom and would have new ideas, which is, are there new ways of collecting performance measures that people should know about, or that people could be using, like new data collection or technologies?
Can you repeat? My office became loud.
Sure. So Celeste, as I said, is the chair of her department, so she gets a lot of interest. Well, I am several floors above her, and no one's bothering me. So, uh, uh, um, in a world that we're awash with data and awash with new technologies, including sensing technologies, are there new approaches to data collection that people should know about? And I guess a coda to this question could be, some might be from, AI type surveillance technologies. Or is that a concern? Is that helpful for performance measures?
I mean, I could start. I think one area that we're looking to do more, and I think I alluded to it a little bit at the end of my presentation, is using video surveillance in order to particularly get the passenger side. I mean, we can get a lot with the onboard technologies on the transit vehicles, but one of the pieces I'm interested in is the travel behavioral side. And I think that's where some of like the video surveillance and machine learning algorithms could be potentially really helpful.
That's cool. What about, and Celeste, you did touch on this, but what what are some kind of best practices for incorporating equity into performance measures?
Good question. I mean, a lot of it is, of course, utilizing available social demographic data. It's tricky. Sometimes it's used based on making some assumptions about where people live and correlating it to residential location. You can do more with some of the onboard travel surveys. But I think that's a big piece. I think kind of the literature we see a lot of is a lot of those like equity gap type studies where they look at who needs transit the most versus where it's being served. But I think where we could see more work is probably more on the reliability side too, and how that impacts people.
Yeah, I would say some of the more recent developments in data processing, the tools that we have, right? Convey-All, Remix, TBAS, like these suites that layer data sets, right? So it takes census data, employment data, and GTFS files and layers them all on top of each other. Really, for the first time, can give you really in-depth access analyses, right? So you can look at, you know, what level of access do African American folks who live in the metro area have to employment? What level of access do Latinos, older people, younger people, you know, across different occupations, and really start to better understand the dynamics of accessibility in metro areas. So I think that's been a tremendous innovation. Though truth be told, most of that doesn't change that often, right? It takes a pretty massive service change to see a lot of changes in that, like on a quarter to quarter, or even an annual to annual basis. The other thing, going back to your first question, Greg, I kind of wanted to kind of twist your question a little bit, which is that like it's less about like the innovative metrics that are out there. It's what I find often is that I'll go into an agency and they don't know what they have, right? So they've bought some system that produces data or that monitors something, and one person knows about it, and the rest of the team doesn't realize, oh, we have this system that actually can produce metrics, right? I was working with a small agency in the Midwest that wanted to track like successive transfers. And they actually had a system where the customer could alert the driver when they get on the bus, hey, I'm transferring to the number 7. And that driver will tell the driver of the number 7, hey, at the transfer point, I've got someone for you. And it actually tracks whether that was successfully achieved as a transfer. So we were able to produce a metric that was transfer success, right? Versus transfer failure. And you know, literally like one person at that agency knew that system could do that. So it's really about mining it, getting everyone sometimes into one room and saying like, what could we put on the table here, and then what could we use?
I love that example of the transfer success. I think that it is a great use of technology and a critical thing for someone who, you know, is dependent upon that transfer. And I know from discussions with Celeste that this is also a huge issue with getting, you know, high schoolers to school in Baltimore is transfer failures. So if we could track that more clearly, it would be amazing. Switching gears a teeny bit. The keynote speaker and you know, my presentation a little bit touched on the issue of or the underlying issue that to some extent and all your talks actually talked about that, you know, public acceptance of transit is a little bit tied to these performance measures, and we may be, you know, as James pointed out, measuring the wrong things, but in a world where operating subsidies and public support, you know, are a little bit tied to these measures. What can we do to, and your talks have given some hints, but I'd love to have some elaboration about, you know, what can we do to avoid a kind of death spiral of, you know, a bad performance measure and then no subsidy and then just, you know, things get worse. So just some ideas on, you know, better connecting, say, subsidy and performance measurement.
I mean, it's funny you said that, because when I was putting my presentation together, I was like, oh, this snapshot does not look great. But if you look, you know, over time and take multiple snapshots, I think that's where some of these metrics can really be beneficial, where hopefully you're seeing upward trends. And then that can be used to justify, you know, additional funding and spending towards transit. So I struggled a little bit with providing only one snapshot versus multiple and not telling them the full story on my side. But I think that's when it can be very beneficial.
You know,
Celeste may have cut out, or maybe I have cut out.
oh, I heard her. Are you there, Greg?
He
Sounds like
froze.
there may be some issues with his connection.
Yeah,
So
looks that way. Yeah, I was gonna say, oh, I kind of lost my train of thought there. I'm sorry. What was his question was about? Someone remind me.
It was about metrics and subsidies and how.
Yes. Sorry. Thank you so much, Liz. I think the answer to that is to stop talking about ridership and stop talking about revenue. Because you're only talking to that small 4% of the people who are using it in a community. Whereas if you want to talk to those 85% of the people, talk about access to jobs, talk about mobility for people with special needs and low-income families, and all of that stuff that resonates with communities, because then you're going to get the support of 85% of the people instead of 4%. And I think that's a big difference.
Was cut off the internet for a bit, and so it looks like Chad came in to rescue. So I have no idea what was just said, but I know we need to end up, and I just want to thank our speakers for what I'm sure was awesome, what I didn't hear, and what I know was awesome from what I did hear. And I also want to thank Chad for organizing this along with his Caltrans team. So I really appreciate everyone's time and effort in this session.
Absolutely. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, James. Thank you, Celeste. We really appreciate your effort. We're going to now go on a 15-minute break. And when we get back, we will have a session about abstracts that we had submitted and a panel discussion on transit fare policy and planning. So we'll look forward to that. So 15-minute break. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your hard work.
All right. Top of the afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our abstract session and panel discussion on transit fare policy and planning. I'm John Ando. I'm the Transit General Manager for the Redding Area Bus Authority in Redding, California, and I'll be your moderator today. We have an esteemed panel of 4 folks that will be talking to you about transit fare policy and planning. Our first presentation is going to come from Javed Esmapour, and he's a PhD candidate in civil engineering at the University of Calgary, specializing in public transit systems and transportation analytics. His research focuses on network-level transit ridership estimation using innovative approaches in sparse and incomplete data environments, aiming to improve service planning and operational efficiency. Afterwards, our next presenter will be Dr. Reza Mahmoudi. Apologize for that. And he is a postdoctorate fellow at the University of Toronto. He holds a PhD in transportation engineering from the University of Calgary and a PhD in industrial engineering from Isfahan University of Technology. His recent work focuses on applying AI and data-driven optimization techniques to share mobility and integrating flexible route transit with multimodal fixed route networks. His broad research interests include complex system modeling, shared mobility, and microtransit logistics, first and last mile delivery, among others. Our next presenter after that will be Maria Kirshen. She is a transportation planner at the infrastructure firm HTNB, supporting the Sound Transit, West Seattle, and Ballard Links extension projects. She holds a bachelor's degree in law and society with American University and a master's in sustainable transportation and infrastructure planning from the University of Pennsylvania. And then our final presenter will be Dr. Bodan Kapasila, and is an assistant professor in the School of Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Iowa. Bodan's research is primarily concerned with the efficiency of transportation systems, particularly how land use, built environments, technology, and transport policy influence people's travel behavior and impact their well-being. Bodan has worked in academic, private, and public sector settings on travel satisfaction, transit safety, transit electrification, technological innovation, micromobility, and transport impact assessments. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn this over to Javad to talk about his presentation.
Sure, thank you so much, John, and I'm so glad to be here and presenting my work on network level OD estimation. So I'm gonna talk about the impact of emerging automatic fare collection, or AFC, systems on such estimation. So again, I'm Jawad Ismailpour. I'm a PhD candidate from University of Calgary, and my supervisor is Dr. Said. So for introduction, my work is around estimating network level origin destination, or I'm referring to OD from now on. And the OD estimation actually maps where passengers start and end their trips across the entire transit network. And it is considered particularly important both transit planning and operation tool. In transit planning, it is considered for identifying high demand corridors and planning new routes, and can also be used for determining where extensions or feeder services are needed. And in transit operation, it can help to evaluate service standards and identify inefficiencies, and it can be used for optimize resource allocation and align supply with demand. And historically, data from automatic fare collection or AFC systems, although their main purpose is for fare management, but OD matrices have been always considered a valuable byproduct of such systems. And we are also witnessing modern approaches for AFC systems. I mean, apart from famous smart card systems, so we have mobile ticketing apps, and we have credit card based payments that can actually shift this how we deal with this OD estimation from this system. So in mobile ticketing app, we have MyFare, which is used in Calgary Transit, and we also have NY Waterway, which is used in East River Ferry in New York City. In case of credit card based payments, we have Tap and Ride, which is used in Bay Area Rapid Transit, California. We have Omni, which is used in New York City MTA, and we have Via Metropolitan Transit in San Antonio. So traditionally, so some background on OD network level OD estimation. Traditionally, this AFC information only records boarding stops and location, and we have to somehow infer destination from this consecutive sequence of transactions AFC data. And trip chaining is actually been used for this purpose. It has two main assumptions: continuity assumption and day symmetry trip assumption. So in continuity assumption, it assumes that next trip boarding is should be close to the previous trip's alighting point. And for the last stop of the day should be again near the first stop of the same day. And using these simple rule-based algorithms, we can have network level OD from AFC data. And the other useful common practice here is actually to scale these seed matrices from this AFC data, because they are not always complete to the some automatic passenger counter or APC data. And the reason for these incomplete seed matrices might be some non-inferred cases. For example, we might have some non-AFC users or low AFC penetration rate, especially for modern AFC systems that I talked about at early stages. These are not really comes with high penetration rate. And we might have some people tapping once. They cannot be fit in this trip chaining algorithm. We might have large distance between alighting and next boarding, again, violating this continuity assumption. And we always can have some data errors. But the question is that can we use and apply this trip chaining and scaling, which has been used extensively to the same emerging AFC systems? So again, I'm going to talk about the MyFare mobile ticketing app content, but it is applicable to all other similar modern AFC systems. So these systems definitely have some benefits. For example, they have convenient digital ticket purchases and validation, and actually can enable collection of passenger demographic data. But the challenges, as they are again comes with a relatively low usage rate at earlier stages. For example, in Calgary Transit, we have only 20 to 30% of passenger MyFare, the majority are single ticket users. And they have actually some heterogeneous user base as well. The majority of users are university students. And this is actually give us some insight that we need some alternatives for OD estimation in such context. So some literature review regarding OD estimation. So we have two main approaches of analytical and probabilistic. So I'm going to cover this really quickly. In analytical aspect, which I talked about, this trip chaining and scaling, we have plenty of studies doing this. And in the probabilistic approach, again, this shifts the OD scaling to some underlying distribution behind this OD pattern and alighting probabilities. But the important thing here is the gap of knowledge that exists in this area that is make them unable to use modern AFC system for OD estimation. So in analytical approach, the limitation is that only one source of data can be used as the seed matrix, and the impact of lower penetration rates hasn't been explored. For example, the lowest penetration rate system that is used as the AFC data for this stops to 75% to 90%. And we actually, I actually showed that in a conference paper that I had previously, that any penetration rate below 65% yields unaccepted scaling accuracy. And in probabilistic approach, they are only limited to root level OD flows, not any network level estimation. And there is not accurate formulation for containing multiple data sources. For example, if you have a multiple AFC system currently working, or other data sources from emerging technologies and so on. And again, my proposed methodology actually deals with this and estimate a hierarchical Bayesian model that I propose, estimate network level OD by including transfer flow estimation, and can integrate multiple data sources, especially from modern AFC systems, and is somehow robust to data incompleteness, I mean, systems with lower penetration rates. So this is a quick overview of my methodology. Again, starting with data cleaning and AFC data preparation, I'm going to deploy my hierarchical Bayesian model, and finally some network level OD construction. I will cover this in this presentation, these steps. And I also does this my methodology on a design experiment, because I don't have complete access to the Calgary transit dataset. So I just want to test my methodology in a simulated network. So I used Sioux Falls Transit Network for this stage. It has 24 zones, which I use each as a bus stop. I consider 5 bus routes with 20-minute headway in a 2-hour period. And I use simple trip generation attraction scheme for OD as a zone to zone, and for trip assignment, I use the Dijkstra algorithm with the cost function as in vehicle time, expected waiting time as a half of headway, and 20-minute transfer penalty. And with this itinerary assigned, I extract my useful data set for conducting this research, which is the simulated true OD for benchmarking and assessing accuracy. And I extract APC data and AFC data, which is simply just sampled itineraries from this simulated true OD matrix. And I consider 10 to 90% sample size as a representation of penetration rates. And I also apply the adjustment factor of 0.76 for accounting non-inferred cases, which is common to trip chain, because we assume that this AFC data comes from trip chain. And for my methodology, so if I start with root level OD flow estimation, again, this is considered if we connect APC data with OD flows for a bus route, it is considered a linear inverse problem, because we know the APC count X, which contains both boarding and alighting counts. We have OD vectors as our estimables, and we have a routing matrix that connects these OD flows with the APC count. And the obvious fact here is that this solution space is quite large. We can have a really big set of OD flows that can satisfy the same APC count as marginal totals. So we have to somehow narrow down this solution space to the reality. And Bayesian inferencing can actually does this for us by two techniques, which the first is that considering stable alighting probabilities, we introduce alighting probabilities as the probability that if passenger board a stop, what would be the probability of alighting at any of the downstream stops. And we consider this probability as stable during the study period. And we also have additional information from AFC data incorporated into this formulation. And the hierarchical model that I consider here is a multinomial likelihood, which connects our data to the alighting probabilities, conjugate Dirichlet distribution, which introduce the concentration parameters. I also consider hyperprior as a non-informative flat distribution. And finally, my posterior, which is a product of these three terms, and it needs sampling from using Markov chain Monte Carlo. And we can finally have our estimable of OD flows, alighting probabilities, and concentration parameters. And my next step is to estimate transfer flows. And I use this terminology, Z, and I define primary route and secondary route at each transfer. As you can see in this picture, the route L is my primary route and route K is my secondary route. And I consider some constraint for this to relate them with the APC count. So from primary route, the sum of transfer flows plus non-transfer passengers should be equal to alighting count from that stop of primary route. And for secondary route is the opposite. The transfer flows plus first boarding passengers should equal the number of boarding passengers from secondary route. And the next step is that how we can find valid transfers in the network. So I consider 4 criteria for this: spatial, temporal, topological, and logical, which use to find transfer flows to be estimated. So spatial means these transfers must occur within a maximum walking distance. The temporal is a maximum transfer time, and topological says that transfer must be part of a non-circuitous link trip, and some logical criteria that the routes must be different, and so on. And as the final steps, we have to define transfer blocks as well, because in OD estimation problem, we have inherently routes which connects OD flows with the APC count, but in transfer blocks, in transfer estimation, we have to somehow tell our model that these transfer flows are connected with these APC counts. So again, we have to come up and create some group of stops that transfer between them is feasible. So these actually are the group of stops that within a walking distance threshold or served by at least one different route. And finally, when we have these transfer blocks across our network, we apply our Bayesian inference, because again, within each of these transfer blocks, the solution space is again huge, and we have to narrow it down. And again, we define the transfer probabilities, and we incorporate transfer information from AFC data. And using this and the same modeling structure, we apply our Bayesian, hierarchical Bayesian model into the transfer flow estimation. And finally, we have to, again, come up with some network level OD as well. Again, we use this OD flows, alighting probabilities, and transfer probabilities to do so. And if we know some linked itineraries that exist from additional data, we assign these transfer flows to them. And if it is not exist, we have to assign these transfer flows uniformly to all the linked itineraries that are feasible for the specific transfer flows. And again, we use these non-transfer probabilities and transfer probabilities and alighting probabilities of second route. And with this, we can come up with this singleton and linked flows. And the summation of those together, both groups of singleton and linked trees, gives us the final network level OD matrix. And in case of results, this is actually results for the OD flow of route C southbound with the OD pair of 3 to 23. And we can see that, so I consider 3 different cases of penetration rate of 30%, 60%, 90% as the low, moderate, and high penetration rate. And again, the top row is for the concentration parameter, the middle one is the lighting probability, and the bottom one is the OD flows. And this red square and red dashed line are the simulated true. As you can see, my methodology is quite robust to the penetration rate of AFC system, and they are quite close to the ground truths. And this is quite the same for the transfer flows as well. For example, this is again the same pattern for transfer flows. We have a primary route of A southbound, and we have the first transfer option of C northbound. And we can see that again, quite accurate and robust to penetration rate, but it is a bit more sensitive to penetration rate than OD flows. And again, this is the same primary route, but with another transfer option, same pattern. And this is the final transfer option, which is non-transfer, which again, my model can predict that quite accurately across different penetration rates. And finally, I have a network level accuracy assessment as well. So on the y-axis, I have Taylor's inequality coefficient, which is a dissimilarity comparison metric between matrices. And I have 2 graphs. Each one compares the network level OD from these methods with the ground truth. And the red one is my method, and the blue one is the ISF, or itinerary scaling factor, which is a well-known network level scaling method. As you can see, my method outperforms the scaling at the lower penetration rates. This is because of the presence of zeros in lower penetration rates, which penalize the scaling factors, but doesn't have any much effect in the distribution context of this method. And finally, as some conclusions, my approach actually builds some network level OD tables, and it can be extended to multiple data sources, some other AFC systems or portable devices and so on. And as we saw, it outperforms the scaling in sparse or incomplete data. And it can have many applications, for example, in modern transit agencies with fragmented data with lower penetration rates, for sure. And again, handles incomplete or external AFC data, such as mobile ticketing or credit card validation, which always at the earliest stage comes with the lower penetration rates. And finally, it can be used for including emerging technologies, such as portable devices that passengers actually carry through their transit journey. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. That was my presentation.
Thank you so very much. We
Yep.
really appreciate that presentation.
Thank you.
We're now going to go on to our next speaker, Dr. Bodan Kapasilia. No, I'm sorry. I'm skipped. I apologize. Dr. Resna Mahmoudi. All right, there you are. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, John, and hello, everyone. Today I'm going to present one of our projects that we did for the City of Calgary, Decision Support Framework for Expanding Express Transit Networks, the case of Calgary. This project was done by me, Professor Saidi, and Professor Virasinghe, both from the University of Calgary. Okay, let's start with an introduction. Calgary is a city in the Canadian province of Alberta. It is located in the south end of the famous Calgary-Edmonton corridor. The city sits on the eastern foothills of the Canadian Rockies, about 80 kilometers east of the mountains. Actually, you can see the Rockies from downtown Calgary. They form a stunning backdrop, especially at sunset. If you have not visited Calgary yet, I would recommend visiting the city as soon as you can. Maybe not in winter, but it's absolutely stunning the rest of the year. By the way, as of 2021, Calgary had the population of almost 1.3 million and a metropolitan population of 1.5 million, making Calgary the third largest city and fifth largest metropolitan area in Canada. But what about now? It has been estimated that the current population of Calgary is around 1.56 million, and the population of the metropolitan area is around 1.8 million. It means almost a 20% increase in population in just 4 years. We had a lot of reasons for this crazy increase. We had tours, a lot of people moved to Canada, a big portion of them moved to Calgary, Alberta. The economy of the city is booming, housing is more affordable, tax rate is low compared to other provinces. So we had a lot of reasons that people decided to move to Calgary in last 4 years. And that's not all. If we analyze the land area growth for the city of Calgary, we will notice that since 1981, in almost 40 years, the land area of the city has been doubled, and it continues. We are seeing more and more new communities, especially in north of the city. Looking at the population growth, we will notice that huge portion of population growth are happening in outer suburb of the city, and a small portion is happening in developed areas. And the city is planning to achieve a balance among population growth in developed and developing area by 2076. So as you can see, because of a lot of these crazy, rapid, significant changes in the city, Calgary has everything to be the big enemy of transit planners. Speaking about the transit in Calgary, we have a big variety of transit services in Calgary. We have standard bus services. We have light rail transit service, which is also called C-Train. Right now, we have 2 active transit lines, red line and blue line, and the third line, the green line, is under construction. We have a bus rapid transit network, which also called MAX network, and we do provide paratransit services and on-demand transit services for specific communities. The total ridership was around 145 million trips as of 2024 for the whole transit service in Calgary. Let's focus on C-Train and MAX to express transit service within the city. The C-Train began operation on May 1981 and has continued to expand alongside Calgary's growing population. As of 2024, the system recorded an annual ridership of 95 million, averaging around 280K weekday trips in the second quarter of 2025, making it the second busiest LRT system in North America. Approximately 45% of workers in downtown Calgary take the C-Train to work. And speaking about our BRT service, the MAX system opened in November 2018 with 3 routes: MAX Orange, MAX Teal, and MAX Purple. And the 4th route, the MAX Yellow line, opened in 2019. So our BRT service right now have 4 active transit routes. So everything seems perfect for our transit system. So what is the problem? We have Route Ahead in Calgary. Route Ahead is Calgary Transit's 30-year strategic plan that guides the delivery of safe, accessible, and customer-oriented transit service for Calgarians. It is structured around 3 core principles: customer experience, network planning, and financing transit to shape transit service over the next 3 decades. Route Ahead is informed by the Municipal Development Plan, which describes the vision for growth in Calgary over the next 60 years. Route Ahead was originally approved by City Council in 2013, and it has been regularly updated since then. So let's see how the future of C-Train and MAX, our express transit services, looks like in Route Ahead. So as I mentioned, right now we have two active LRT lines, the red line and the blue line in the city. The green line, the third line, is under construction. North leg is almost constructed, and they are working on the south leg. And we have 4 active BRT lines, Max Purple, Max Yellow, and Max Orange, and Max Teal. So all other gray lines that you are seeing here, they are planned express line for the future of the express transit network in Calgary in Route Ahead. And just one of them is an LRT line. Others are BRT lines. This part is LRT line, which connects the blue LRT line to the green line crossing the airport business area. And as you can see, the majority of the significant changes in the express transit network is planned to be happen in the north and south and east-west end of the city, where we think that we will see a lot of new communities and a lot of new transit demand over the next 3 decades. Some of these communities is even doesn't exist yet, but we know that we will be there in next 3 decades. So what's the question? The question raised by the city was, is the proposed plan for the future of the C-Train and MAX networks in Route Ahead still valid? Or does it require revision in light of recent changes within the city? Remember, we mentioned that we are experiencing 20% increase in the population of the city just in last 4 years. So what is our solution for this question? Looking at the question from theoretical perspective, actually it's a network design and operation planning problem. So we have new information, new data. We need to design the bimodal express transit network that we have in Calgary based on this data, and check it to see if the solution matches with the suggested plan by Route Ahead or it doesn't match. We know that transit network design and operation planning problem is a highly complicated problem in transportation science because of a lot of reasons. There are 4 main methodologies used in the literature and practice to deal with this problem: analytical approaches, mathematical programming and optimization algorithms, simulation tools, and empirical approaches. We came with a different idea. We suggested to use hybrid approaches by integrating analytical approaches and mathematical programming to deal with this bimodal express transit network design problem. We suggested to break the problem into 2 different sub-problems, where in the first sub-problem, we first solve the station location problem, and we identify the location of new LRT and BRT stations. Then in the second step, based on the results of the first stage, we optimize the design of a new LRT and BRT routes or the extension of existing LRT and BRT routes. So at the end of the day, we will have the location of new LRT and BRT stations, the design of new LRT and BRT lines, extensions of existing LRT and BRT lines, and also we will provide headway for each transit line and required fleet size to serve passengers on each transit line. So as you may notice from my table, in all our analysis, we do consider both users' cost and transit agencies' cost, and it's because of transit Route Ahead, because they say that our planning should be customer-oriented. So we do consider waiting cost, access cost, riding cost, transfer cost, and stopping cost as users' cost, and in the transit agency side, we do consider operating cost and capital costs. I won't go through the details of the methodology, and I will just briefly review our methodology. The first stage, as I mentioned, was station location optimization model. The process of the first stage includes identifying the coverage area of existing bimodal express transit network, capturing geographical and maximum walking distance constraints for each zone, determining the trade-off between capital and operation cost and passenger accesses, and finally obtaining a station density for each zone. For this stage, we use continuum approximation and analytical approaches, and we came with a closed form solution that easily provides us the location of new LRT stations, new BRT stations, and potential transfer stations. So we solved the first stage, we identified the location of new stations. Now in the second stage, we need to optimize the design of transit routes. We know this stage is an MPR problem. We cannot deal with it with analytical approaches. So we developed an optimization model in which we had minimizing the summation of total waiting cost, total transfer cost, total riding cost, and total operating cost, and total capital cost in its objective function, subject to different sets of constraints like network design constraints, choice model and demand constraints, capacity and operation constraints, budget constraints, and of course, existing express transit network constraints. And solving this stage, we will find the optimal design of new BRT lines and LRT lines. So let's review some of our results for the city of Calgary. We were so lucky that city of Calgary BRT lines and LRT lines. So yeah, we were so lucky that Calgary Transit provided us with very detailed projected demand data for 2024 and 2076. And of course, we required a lot of complicated advanced computer programming which had a genetic algorithm in its heart, integrated with the optimization models and analytical approaches, which were able to provide us very high quality solutions, which with the error rate of less than 1.5%. So we used those data sets. We developed a lot of scenarios for our project. Here you see the existing bimodal express transit network in Calgary. I'm going to show you the results based on the projected demand data for 2076. First, the location of new LRT and BRT stations. If we solve our approach for the city of Calgary, this will be the location of new LRT and BRT stations. Gray crosses are BRT stations, and black ones are the location of new LRT stations. As you can see, majority of new LRT stations are located in the north of the city, where we are going to have a lot of new communities, a lot of new demand for transit service. For the south of the city, we just have 3 new LRT stations. The demand is not that much high like north of the city, and also the south of the city is already oversaturated with the existing bimodal express transit service. But we did also a lot of analysis on different scenarios. For example, if we solve the second stage of the framework, we will find the design of new LRT and BRT routes. So this is the solution that our approach suggests for the future of bimodal express transit network of Calgary based on the projected demand data for 2076. If we compare this with what Route has suggested, we will see a lot of overlaps between two plans, but also there are some significant differences. In particular, the main difference between our plan and Roothead's plan is related to a LRT system. The only LRT route that Roothead is suggested is the one to connect the blue line to the green line in the northeast end of the city. Our solution confirms that suggestion, but it also suggests to extend this route to serve passengers in the northwest end of the city. In addition to that, our solution says that we have huge demand for transit in the north of the city in the future that justifies having a new LRT route in the north of the city. Those are two main differences between our solution and what Roothead is suggested. And we did a lot of what if analysis as well. What if the real demand in 2076 will be much higher than what we have predicted? So we did, say, for example, analysis based on 130% of projected demand for 2076. And we noticed that since the projected demand data for 2076 is actually already very aggressive, the city is oversaturated already with the bimodal express transit service designed based on the projected demand for 2076. So playing with this demand in the future won't affect the design of bimodal express transit network significantly. So we can claim that the result is really stable and robust. Yes, we will have some minor changes, especially in BRT side, but for LRT side, we won't see huge changes in the design of the bimodal express transit network. And as I mentioned before, in addition to the location of new LRT and BRT stations and the design of new LRT and BRT routes and extension of existing transit routes, our framework provides other outputs as well: headway on each transit line, lengths of each transit line, number of stations on each transit line, number of transfer stations where two transit lines meet each other in those stations and facilitate the transfer between two transit lines, and required fleet size to serve passengers on each transit line. As conclusion, we developed an approach that provides an efficient initial solution for mass transit network. Our approach is useful for transit network design, redesign, and extensions projects. It's capable of handling multimodal transit network design problems. It can be applied for any network settings like urban or regional networks and different scenarios given the data input. And breaking the problem to two different sub-problems and solving one of them analytically reduce the complexity of the problem significantly. So what are the next steps? Actually, I'm not in Calgary anymore. I'm not even in Toronto anymore. I have relocated to Columbus, Ohio area, but I'm in touch with our people in Calgary. The revision of Roothead is not finalized yet in regarding the changes in bimodal express transit network of Calgary. They are working on other dimensions. They are working on how to include transit electrification dimensions in the planning of express transit network in Calgary, different modes of transit electrification, priority bus routes for electrifications, location of charging stations, and how they affect the design of bimodal express transit network. They are studying how to integrate emerging transit services like ODT with the express transit network, and of course how to include the resiliency, network resiliency dimension in the next update of Roothead. So far, we had around 8 publications coming out from our partnership with the City of Calgary. The latest one is published in Transportation Research Party. If you are interested to see more details about our project in Calgary, you can read this paper. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much for your presentation. It was also very informative. We're now going to go on to our next presenter, and that is going to be Marielle Persson.
Actually, I'm so sorry, John. I think, Bo, do you have a small window for presentation?
Yes, that's actually would be preferable. I have a class that starts in 2 minutes, so I'd prefer to go now if it's possible.
Yeah, I wasn't sure.
No worries on my part.
I wasn't sure if you were going to make it, so yeah, go for it.
Perfect. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking us to Calgary. Calgary is always very close to my heart. I did my PhD in Edmonton, so I always emulate some of the things that are available in Calgary. But I'm taking you on a ride to Midwest US to take a look at some of the results that we found with the introduction of the free fare transit in the small urban region that I currently live in. And the reason I'm interested in the topic of fares is that we generally tend to discuss a lot of benefits that come with the transit, less congestion, better environment, people who walk to transit see a better health outcome, they interact with each other more, and transit is believed to be genuinely cheaper than driving. Nevertheless, the fare is still acting as an obstacle. And as an illustration, I have this photo that I took just this Saturday, I believe, in Minneapolis, where somebody left a ticket that still had like an hour in it of the transfer window. So people perceive the cost of fare as an obstacle for some to engage in it. So the idea of free fares is definitely not new, and it took off more prominently in the US during the COVID times when there was federal funding available to actually pay for the programs and to test them out. Some of them were longer in period than the others, some captured larger geographies than the other, but what wasn't clear is actually the motivation to pursue them. Because there are so many angles to free fares and to fare policy in general. Some people say that we need fares because they pay for the service, and as anything else in economics, you only value the service that you have to pay for. So it's quite intuitive that if you're getting the benefit, something should be getting out of your pocket. On the other hand, there is a school of thought saying that the fares are so low and that they don't really impact how people engage with the service, and it's other aspects like frequency, coverage, quality of the service, the perks on board that make you tick and make you want to use transit service. We should also remember that fares have a cost of collection, which means that we're actually spending on technology, on people, on the effort to enforce that all of the riders pay for the service. And lastly, there are some researchers who claim, and this is more on the advocacy side, saying that removing fares actually increases the social benefits because now people actually can travel more and they are not hindered by the obstacle of cost. Research is quite limited in that regard, and we know not a lot in that area. So there are multiple approaches and multiple angles to the topic of free fares, and that's actually how I arrived to Iowa City, where I'm currently the assistant professor in the School of Planning Affairs, School of Planning and Public Affairs. Apologies. And I arrived in August 2024. The pilot for free fares started in August 2023. And it started as a 2-year pilot, again, funded through the CARES Act, the COVID relief funding that federal government provided. And the objectives for the agency were primarily to increase affordability, which follows along the comp plan for the city, but also to reduce the emissions, acknowledging that transportation accounts for a large amount of emissions. So hoping that some people would switch from driving to using transit if the cost of the fare is removed. A little bit of on the context of the city and what makes this study quite special is that Iowa City is a college town, and there are a few cities nearby that are covered by the transit network. But still, the main employers are the university and the hospitals next to the university. And the unique environment where we are is that our small region of 75,000 people still has 3 transit agencies that overlap in their service. We have Iowa City, we have Coralville Transit that is serving primarily 2 suburban communities, but still overlaps with Iowa City downtown. And we have the University Transit System CAN-bus that also overlaps with parts of the system. So I perceived that from the get-go as a natural experiment. We have 3 systems that in certain extents overlap, and Iowa City went fare-free in August 2023. Coralville Transit continuously connects fares, and CAN-bus, the University Transit System, has been free since the beginning, and is open to the public as well, not only students. So the questions that we asked when we approached the study were there are any impacts on ridership? Are people happier, or are they just genuinely satisfied with the service as it is provided now? And whether there are any impacts on safety. So we're pursuing this angle, this study and these data sets that we have available primarily from the efficiency perspectives and the customer satisfaction perspective. And the data that we're using is quite diverse. We have the entities database to track broader trends over the last couple of years, basically the last decade. I also sourced transit app surveys, so the Smart Forward trip planning application that collects information from transit users about their satisfaction with the trip for the region, and these are agency specific. And I also sourced 10 years worth of police records that had the transit tag in one of their keywords. And we used various approaches to the analysis, but the most engaged part was to actually perform the multi-level regression using the daily route level aggregates for all of the system. But we started descriptively, and we looked at the last 10 years of ridership using entities data. So we are comparing here CAN-bus, the University Transit System, Coralville Transit, Iowa City that went fare-free, but also 2 more cities that the city likes to compare itself to, and both are college towns. We have Cyride in Ames, which is also in Iowa City, where the Iowa State University is, and also Mountain Line in Missoula, another college town. So unsurprisingly, 2020 hit everybody hard, and the consistent lines show ridership, so it dipped, and the dashed lines show the vehicle revenue miles, and some of the services reduced their provision, some of them remained at the same level. But that becomes more interesting as we look at the recovery more. So looking at the 2023-2024 stretch, we can see that some agencies increased their vehicle revenue miles, basically boosted the service, and most of the agencies saw an increase in ridership. And so in that context, the ridership increase in Iowa City looks on par if you look at Cyride or if you take a look at Missoula. So it's an upward trend. And that's what kept making me skeptical about the whole effect of free fares anytime the city reported an increase in ridership, because I was simply saying that this is a post-COVID recovery that we're seeing everywhere else in the nation. To kind of justify myself, I decided to normalize ridership by vehicle revenue miles. And when we take a look at that, we can see that the slope for Iowa City is actually steeper, suggesting that probably there's something more than just the vehicle revenue miles that drives the increase in ridership on Iowa City Transit. Potentially, that might be fares. To examine that, we looked at the estimates for the multi-level regression, where we controlled for the random effects at the level of agency and at the level of every route. And we're looking at the log transformed daily route ridership. So that's why I'm asking you to look not at the estimates, but to actual transformed values that should be read as percentages. So what we can see is that Iowa City, compared to Coralville Transit, or the average daily route ridership on Iowa City Transit, was not that different, or is not statistically significant different from Coralville, suggesting that the average route ridership is comparable between the two systems. It is different on the university transit by whole 235%, which is not surprising because university transit system is so suited to connect students from dorms to their campus buildings and other activities on campus. It is mainly provided there and designed to be there to serve the students. When I looked at the census level information and at the share of low-income residents served by a certain route, I found, not surprisingly, that the more prominent share of low-income residents there is, the higher share of riders, or the higher share of increase of riders those routes saw. I also controlled for weather, since these are daily estimates, and not unsurprisingly, if it rains or if it freezes, there are fewer people riding transit, so nothing surprising there. Looking at the effect of weekend, we live in a small town. There's not too many things you can do over the weekend. There is a drop in ridership, unsurprisingly. But if we're looking at the academic semester, since students are not constantly here, and there's this tranquil period of where the majority of students are actually away from the city. So during the academic semester, we obviously see a daily increase, an increase in ridership on a daily basis. What becomes even more interesting is that the free fare period didn't have effect on all of the routes on average, but if we're looking at the Iowa City Transit and compare it to our reference category, Coralville, we can see that ridership went up by 37%. So bottom line is that while controlling for everything that we could possibly control with the data that we had in hand, we were able to capture the effect of free fares on Iowa City Transit as leading to an increase in ridership by 37% compared to the system that didn't change its fare policy and continuously collects fares. Did that have any effect on riders? As reportings from Transit App suggest, people see their trip as satisfactory, or used to see before the free fare period and after the free fare period, both not only on Iowa City Transit, but on all the systems. So we have a consistent high satisfaction with the quality of service that is being provided. This also applies to the vehicles itself and their condition, and I parsed it by different times of the day, since I didn't have the pre-data, since Transit collects different questions, or started collecting different questions at different time periods. But again, comparing different systems, we don't see any difference between the three. We even didn't do any statistical analysis because comparing the difference of like 0.01 wouldn't make any impact or meaning. There's no issue of crowding, and to me it means that there was this excess capacity that the system was capable of accommodating, and people still view transit as safe. So even though ridership went up and there are more people, that didn't really have a significant impact to change the perceived safety on transit. So I captured the perceived safety through survey data that was available to me, but what about the objective value of safety? To understand that, I looked at the police records pertaining to transit, and I normalized it by ridership. So again, the peak was at the issues started growing as there were fewer people riding transit and more safety incidents were reported to police. But in 2023, as ridership was going up and obviously safety incidents were still prevalent, the per capita value was going down, only suggesting that any issues that are observed with safety on the system are mainly coming from the sheer increase in ridership and the more people engaging with each other. Are these the issues that we should be concerned about? Well, in the past, what was the main source of growth for safety incidents were the harassments and assaults. But these actually declined since Iowa City went fare free. And what went up is the vagrancy. So there are people who probably have no other places to go to, and who spend their time in public spaces and public places, which public transit in this case is a representative of, given especially that there's no obstacle of cost. So the bottom line of the study is that I found the evidence that while even controlling for other exogenous and endogenous factors, Iowa City saw an increase in ridership. There seem to be no negative impacts on riders and the customer satisfaction, and safety seems to be still in place and not preventing people from engaging with the service. So the big elephant in the room, the big question is, how much does it cost? And how can they proceed? Before they went fare free, it cost about $1 million for them to, they were able to collect about 1 million in fare box, which accounted for about 18 to 20%, depending on the year that you're looking at, for their fare box recovery. So what they have to come up with annually means is estimated at about $1 million. What they are doing to meet that, and especially given that federal subsidy is running out, and they need to come up with internal funding, given that they continued the program and will be reviewing it on an annual basis as long as they can pay for it. So the sources that they are looking to pay for it is the increase in parking fees. They increased it initially in August 2024, but had to come back or cut back on those because it was very controversial and was met with a high uproar from the public. They didn't return it to the initial level, but it wasn't that high as they expected it to be initially. They are currently considering, the city is currently considering to increase the fees for gas and electric by 1%, and that would be the most stable source of funding. They're considering the local sales tax, but the challenge in Iowa is that local communities can only increase it by 1%, so it's not a huge amount of money. And the irony is that for them to bring the fares back, they would have to invest about $1 million in new technology plus annual fees, given that these would be subscription policies. So the system seems to be working, but given the challenges with funding, as anything else that it requires financial support, there are still many things that need to be considered. Hopefully, these lessons learned will be applicable and useful for other communities as well. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me via email, because unfortunately I cannot stay for the Q&A because I have a class to teach. Thanks.
Thanks for jumping on with us, and hopefully you have a good class today.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Enjoy the rest of the show.
Happy trails. All right, we'll go on to our last but not least presenter, Marielle Kirshen.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Let's get to share my screen. And that was a really interesting presentation for me to hear because I was actually involved in the evaluation study for Fare Free Transit for Iowa City. So very cool to see that living on. But anyway, today I'm here I guess I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Marielle Kirshen. I'm a project manager at HNTB in Seattle, Washington. And today I am going to present on some work that I completed back in 2021, 2022 for a Transit Cooperative Research Program Report 237, which is the Fare Free Transit Evaluation Framework. And since I did this work, I've moved on from fare policy and fare free evaluation. So I am now working on light rail expansion in Seattle. So this information right now reflects where we were back in 2023. It doesn't, when the report was published, it doesn't reflect anything super recently beyond that. But so it's very interesting to hear Bo's presentation in terms of how things have been evaluated later on, and then how that information can be shared back with transit agencies. So just to move in here, want to set a definition for what we're talking about when we mean fare free transit. And this is a phrase that oops, sorry, my slides are automatically advancing. Let me just make sure. I'm going to stop presenting and make sure that doesn't keep going, because that's going to throw me off. But I can keep speaking. So it goes by multiple terms. And so some people call it zero fare. Some people don't want to use the word free because of the perception that people won't value the system. So, sorry, I'm trying to talk as I am changing this. I'm not sure where the settings are. Anyway, so we use Fare Free Transit for the purpose of this presentation and for the purpose of the report. I like to see it from the perspective of riders in terms of what they are paying and how they're perceiving it. So there are two types of fare-free transit that we talk about in the report. One is fully fare-free transit. So this is when a transit agency doesn't collect any fares from riders. Iowa City was a good example of that. And so that's like, there's no fare collection system on the trains. There's also partial fare-free transit, which is something that we see across the country. Sorry, I'm just going to have to keep going back on my slides. Or maybe I'll just present faster. When a transit agency does not collect fares from a specific group of people on specific routes or transit services or in a defined area. So the process for this work, for the TCRP report, was first taking a look at what's the existing literature and media out there to date. So this has been a topic that especially has grown or gained steam since the 2020 COVID pandemic, where a lot of transit agencies were operating fare-free, and there had also been a kind of uptick in a lot of the research around that in the framework of equity. So also, once we understood where the literature was, we surveyed transit agencies across the country and got a sense of whether they were operating fare-free, how they came to those decisions, maybe they were considering going fare-free in the future. We interviewed those specific transit agencies from that group. We also spoke to community organizations and advocacy groups about what they were seeing in their communities. And then finally, we developed an evaluation framework and mini case studies to dig in, dig in deeper to what agencies were working on in an effort to provide other transit agencies with examples. So here's a map of where the agencies were, where we surveyed and made case studies. So there were 35 total transit agencies. Some of them represented full fare-free, some partial, some not fare-free, but were evaluating fare-free transit in a few places. And then from there, as I mentioned, developed some mini case studies, and we wanted this to represent agencies of different sizes and from across the country. So as we spoke to transit agencies, surveyed, looked through the literature, we discovered that there were 4 main themes that covered the impacts that agencies were seeing. So first of all, access, mobility, and equity. So this is really focusing on the riders and how it's affecting the way that they're able to travel around their communities, whether or not they're using the service more, and then how it was affecting equity. The second is looking from the operational transit agency perspective. How is fare-free transit going to affect their ability to provide and operate quality service? So this relates to, are they able to operate more streamlined because they're not not collecting fares? Is it something that they're seeing in terms of delays on the vehicles because of safety and security issues, et cetera? The third is looking at financial health of the agency. So how is this affecting their fare revenue? Sorry, again, advancing. How is this affecting their fare revenue? Is this affecting revenue streams, long-term financial well-being, and also looking at opportunities for improving their financial health? So then the fourth one, this was a catch-all category. So this is really looking at the community impacts. So a lot of the external impacts to the agency and how it's impacting the community's economy, sustainability, and congestion. This relates back to a lot of what Bo is presenting. So there's a lot of, at least when I was working on this, there was a gap in measuring what those external factors were. And so a lot of agencies are focusing on that last bucket as one of the benefits of fare-free transit, but it is hard to measure. Okay, so now on the slides, this is the presentation of the full evaluation framework. So that is made up of 10 steps to help agencies evaluate whether fare-free transit is right for them. Fare-free transit should not be seen as a one-size-fits-all policy. It really depends on agencies framing up what their goals are and what works for them. So I will go through the steps under the three main phases, which is getting organized, making a plan, and evaluating whether it's right for them. And then this last row, after the decision to implement, is coming up with an evaluation plan of after let's say you've implemented fare-free transit, how do you evaluate whether it's successful? And so that's why it was really interesting to see Bo's presentation, because he is doing just that. So starting with getting organized. So one of the most important steps is really setting the context in which you're operating within. What are the factors that have gotten you to where you are right now? Do you have a political or decision maker who's really championing this work? Is the request coming from riders? Is it coming from the agency? So really kind of understanding what your baseline is the next step in terms of doing existing conditions analysis, understanding how people are currently using the system, how they're paying for fares, taking a look at what other transit agencies are doing, looking for agencies that have similar operating characteristics to you, or also looking for some, maybe an aspirational agency or how a much larger agency is dealing with things. And then with all of that information, using that to frame up what are the specific opportunities and challenges for your agency? Is there something that you saw among your peers that you want to implement? Is there something that you think is going to be a really large challenge? And so using that to set up the, sorry, my slides are advancing. Really set up the framework specific to your agency. So here are some examples of what those opportunities and challenges could look like under those 4 themes. So this is very general, that could be applicable to transit agencies, but this will likely look different for your transit agency depending on what your context is and existing conditions. So I won't go through these one by one, but this is based on a lot of what transit agencies had experienced, a lot of the major themes. So things like increasing ridership, improving operational efficiency, a lot of more stable transit funding, since fare collection is dependent on ridership and is hard to predict. And then for community impacts, there's often a goal of reducing automobile trips, perhaps for climate change or congestion reasons. And then a number of challenges across the themes as well. So, is that going to put a strain on your ability to provide additional service? Are you going to experience a lot of ridership on your paratransit service, which is going to overwhelm the system? Is there going to be a loss of farebox revenue that will put a threat on your long-term sustainable funding? and then perhaps there might be a negative perception of transit subsidy. So the second phase of the evaluation framework is making a plan. So you have your opportunities and challenges. How are you going to evaluate whether this is right for your agency? So first step is setting goals and objectives. And then after that, you want to determine what your performance measures are going to be. How are you going to measure whether or not this is successful? Step 7 is, what is going to be your selection criteria? What would have to be the results of your evaluation to be able to make a decision or not? What are going to be those triggers? And then also determining what fare-free transit alternatives you're going to look like. Is that just going to be fare-free transit? Is it going to be partially fare-free transit? Also, I've seen a number of agencies also use low-income fares or discounted fares as one of their alternatives. So here again is an example of what the goals and objectives could be across the 4 themes. So this is where you would identify things like increasing overall transit ridership, which, using the example of Iowa City Transit, they wanted to increase their ridership by 100%. If that's one of your main goals, that's something that you want to make sure you're measuring and have a good way to measure that. Ensuring operational efficiency. We've talked about this a little bit, but you might want to look at what is going to be your capacity on your vehicles and whether the increases in ridership that you've determined from the first theme, whether that's going to overwhelm your system. For under financial health, you want to maybe assess whether or not you're going to be able to maintain your external funding sources. Maybe if you provide fare-free transit to all riders, then the agencies that are perhaps subsidizing or providing a payment in order to get free fares or discounted fares for their specific riders or employees, that might put that under threat. And then finally, under community impacts, you may want to measure, or the goal may be to reduce dependence on single occupancy vehicles. So the third phase within the framework is evaluating. So this is looking at, you've set up your framework, or you've set up your personal goals, objectives, performance measures, selection criteria. And so then you're going to have to execute it. You're going to measure what those potential impacts will be and use that information to select your preferred alternative based on your selection criteria. And here again is an example under the 4 themes. So this is how you are going to kind of work your way through the process, because some of these things may have dependencies. So you want to determine what your ridership increase is going to be based on maybe what you saw happen in peer transit agencies. Then you're going to use that information to determine your transit vehicle capacity, what's your foregone fare revenue, and then what that might mean for automobile trips. So just as a few examples from this slide. So then another really great example of an agency that has done this, so in addition to Iowa City Transit, so this was back in 2021, the Montgomery County Transit Agency called Ride On did a very robust evaluation of a number of transit alternatives. So that was fare free for all, fare free on the weekends, discounted fares, and they picked a number of goals and measures and then executed their evaluation plan and used that to determine whether or not they were going to be fare free. Last I was working with them, they were staying at fare free. And so I don't know if something has moved on since then, but regardless, I thought they did a really great job at having a clear reason why they were making their decisions and having these results. So again, up on the screen is that full evaluation framework under the 3 phases of getting organized, making a plan, and evaluating. And then there's also opportunities to continue that evaluation. And really that's an important piece, is continuing that evaluation after you make a decision to implement, to determine success and also because that information will be really valuable to pass down to other transit agencies. So finally, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry about the slide technical aspects of things, but hopefully it wasn't too difficult to follow along, and happy to participate in the discussion.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate the presentations from all of you. So we got some potential questions that I'll pose to the panel that we can share with the group. So the first one I'll start out is in this symposium, we heard and will hear from experts in the autonomous shuttles, performance metrics, and AI. How do you think new technologies can play a part in improving transit planning? I'll leave it to any one of you guys to chime in.
Yeah, maybe I could jump in there since I'm already on camera. And this relates back to Javad's presentation in the beginning, or something reminded me of this. But with fare collection and with advancements in fare collection technology, there's an opportunity to collect data on riders and how they're currently using the system, and using that to help determine what appropriate fare policy changes could be in the future. You might have data on demographics of your riders and how often they are using the system, how much they're spending on fares, and using that to help set up your evaluation framework. So another way to evaluate pilots also after the fact. So setting your existing conditions and evaluating after the fact. So that's one thing that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Maria. So that's my point exactly. I mean, we have abundance of data with having these various systems implemented in transit agencies, for example, these newer AFC systems, and even these portable devices that passengers can carry during their trips. They are all useful, huge amount of big data that AI can actually help us to extract useful trends from them. And the other thing is actually in real-time analysis. For example, in such scenarios, we need, for example, predicting OD pattern in short intervals of 15 minutes and so on. So this is another place that AI can become really useful and helpful. And regarding autonomous shuttles, so this is not actually my area of research, but I've seen that this type of fleet is being tested in some places like university campuses, airports, and so on. For example, these places are ideal for running at lower speeds or with much less degree of mixed traffic. And this is actually a perfect place for last mile coverage of public transit. For example, these are actually covering less crowded neighborhoods, and these autonomous shuttles can definitely fit into this first and last mile connection as well. And again, if we want to, for example, in near future, we want to use these autonomous shuttles in the main transit operations, and for example, integrating those with other connected vehicle and infrastructure, I see huge potential for increasing reliability, because we pretty much removing human error in transit operation and reducing these delays and so on. And these were my point of view regarding your question, John.
Yeah, just to add a few things to what Java said about the automated vehicles. We did a project for the city of Calgary on the vehicle sizing, fleet sizing for suburbs of Calgary. And one of the interesting findings for us was that we found serving suburbs of Calgary with automated vehicles, small size vehicles, is much more efficient alternative than serving them with even small size buses. So I do agree with Rod. I think automated vehicles, on-demand transit services with automated vehicles are the future of transit, at least for transit deserts for low-density communities in the future.
Thank you all for your responses to that question. Next question I would like to ask is, what lessons have you learned from your projects and/or experiments? Were there any unexpected discoveries that you think can warrant an expanded study?
So I can start on this one because, oh, sorry, am I muted? Okay. I mean, so based on my experience with working with Calgary Transit AFC data, so this data, I mean, stores a lot of useful demographics, such as, so you can opt for different type of fare categories, such as adult, youth, and senior. So this actually gives you a lot of useful information regarding the trip pattern based on age groups. And also, there are some different types of tickets, such as low income, university passes, or employee passes with the exact corporate name on the ticket. Again, a lot of rich and useful information. And again, this is type of information that is modern AFC system provide researchers and transit agencies, and they can actually explore so each of these specific type of passengers, how they react to a new fare policy, and they can easily track that. And again, for example, as a multimodal network with share mobility or mobility as a service, we can again target this specific type of passengers for identifying the hubs for the services or pricing strategies. Because, okay, if this place is mainly commuted by low-income passengers, how this affect the pricing strategy for this multimodality. So again, this opting for modern AFC system instead of that traditional smart cards that can store a lot of useful information that can be used for other area of research is really has a lot of potential, in my opinion.
And I'd say that in our research, I didn't find anything super surprising. I'd been having conversations with transit agencies for a couple of years at that point, and a lot of their concerns and findings and benefits were something that was relatively universal across the industry. But there were a few pieces of additional research that we identified, one of which was that there's a lot unknown about fare recovery in terms of transit agencies are measuring that in different ways across the country. So some of them are counting their like employer subsidy programs and those numbers, and some are not. So some research in terms of how much agencies are really pulling in terms of fare revenue and standardizing that across the industry is important to understand how much revenue is being brought in by fares, because that's such an important decision part of going to fare free or not. And then, of course, another piece, which is a big question across the agency, is what are some of the alternatives to farebox revenue that can be a sustainable source to operate service, and one of those is back to those employer programs and local stakeholders. How can transit agencies get those subsidies regardless of whether or not they're accepting fares or not? So how do you sell the use case for and the benefits of transit to a lot of those agencies, even if they are not personally using transit or their employees are not using transit? So kind of selling the benefits of fare-free transit as a larger community benefit is also something that could use more research.
So my project was not on like fair policy, it was on large scale network design problem. There were a lot of lessons, but two important ones that come to my mind. The first one is that traditionally we see that a lot of people thinks that express corridors should be located on the visible corridors in the city, and we should make the corridors strict as much as possible. But what we did in our project, we relaxed this assumption and we let the corridors to have some zigzags, and we noticed that doing this improves actually the performance of the transit network significantly. It increased the accessibility, equity within the network, and that decrease actually the total cost and travel time within the network. Another important thing is about the access to the stations of BRT and LRT as mass transit services. We noticed that access cost affects the number of the stations on each express transit route. So if we optimize access costs to stations, we will actually reduce the number of stations on express transit lines. And by doing this, we will first save a lot of capital costs. Second, we will make our service more express, more fast. And I'm a big fan of on-demand transit service. And again, I think using services like shared mobility on-demand transit services will help us to optimize the access cost, especially within the communities, and generally improve the performance of our express transit network.
Awesome. Well, panel, I do want to thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chad.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate your fantastic presentations about this important topic, about fares and route planning and data. Really interesting. Really appreciate it. So Mariel, Reza, and Javad, again, very much appreciated. Bo, who isn't here, and then of course to John for moderating this session. It's been fantastic. So again, thank you very much, especially for your ideas and coming to us through the abstract proposal. We will adjourn for the day. Let me go ahead and throw up on the screen what we are doing tomorrow. So tomorrow we are going to have a presentation about high-speed rail, followed by one about rural transit, another about an intercity bus networks, and ending with microtransit and paratransit. So we hope you'll be able to join us tomorrow like you were today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out at pm2.research@dot.ca.gov. So again, thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants today. We wish you a fantastic afternoon or evening, or actually both, and we will see you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.